Chapter 1. The Frozen Bunkhouse. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little colder, a little lonelier, and, somehow, full of beard frost and questionable coffee. So if you're all tucked in, lights dimmed, maybe you've got that one sock that keeps slipping off, perfect. Because tonight, we're heading deep into the northern woods, where men with axes and very little sense of self-preservation built wooden bunkhouses to survive winters that made your eyelashes freeze. It's going to be slow. It's going to be cold. And, let's be honest, it's going to smell faintly of sweat, pine, and bad stew. Let's drift back to the 1800s, the so-called golden age of lumber camps, which is a poetic way of saying the time when men lived like feral raccoons in log boxes for 4 months straight. The woods were hungry. Picture it, somewhere in northern Wisconsin, or maybe Maine, or maybe deep in Quebec. It doesn't matter. It's winter. The air burns your lungs. The trees are enormous, hundreds of years old, and everyone has decided the most logical thing to do is cut them all down. Logging wasn't a job. It was more like a punishment invented by someone who really hated comfort. You'd wake before dawn, which, in northern winter, is about 10 a.m., and stumble out into snow so deep it swallowed your boots. You had your wool, your axe, your coffee that could double as roof tar. And that's it. You and the forest. The men called themselves Lumberjacks, which sounds heroic until you realize most of them were just trying not to die of boredom, frostbite, or scurvy. The companies that hired them knew this. They didn't care. They paid by the tree, not the trauma. But here's the thing, if you wanted lumber, you needed men. And if you wanted men to stay alive long enough to swing axes for 16 hours a day, you had to give them shelter. Thus, the bunkhouse, humanity's least glamorous attempt at comfort. The bunkhouse, a box of men. The word bunkhouse sounds cozy. It's not. It's basically a wooden rectangle stuffed with 20 to 60 humans, a stove, and enough lice to qualify as their own social class. Built fast, built cheap, and usually built by the same exhausted men who'd live in them, bunkhouses were the frontier's answer to, what if we put everyone in one room and hoped for the best? Walls were made of green logs, meaning freshly cut, still wet, still oozing sap. They'd shrink and crack in the cold, letting the wind whistle through like a harmonica. The roof? Bark slabs or rough boards, if you were lucky. Snow piled up so deep that sometimes you couldn't tell if you were inside or buried alive. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from the wood stove, which rarely worked right. One corner was always colder than the rest, and one was always boiling hot. So naturally, the guy who snored the loudest always slept in the warmest spot. The bunks themselves were arranged in tiers, 2, sometimes 3 high. No mattresses, just hay or straw or occasionally damp moss. Pillows? You stuffed your spare shirt in a sack and called it a night. At least one guy per bunkhouse always had fleas. Everyone had body odors strong enough to register as a separate entity. And yet, somehow they made it work. The stove, heart and hazard. Every bunkhouse had a stove, a cast iron beast that never stopped clanging and hissing. It was the only thing between you and a night of freezing solid. But it was also a hazard, because if you fell asleep too close, you could wake up half-cooked. Some camps ran the stove all night. Others didn't, because the boss thought fuel was too expensive. So men slept in layers, wrapped in blankets that hadn't seen soap since the Lincoln administration. The heat created condensation, which froze to the inside of the walls. By morning, the frost would melt and drip back down. It was like living inside a cold, damp lung. Still, that stove was sacred. The man who tended it, usually called the stove tender, was both the most hated and most envied man in the room. He controlled the heat. He decided who froze and who didn't. And if he overslept and the fire went out, 50 angry men would remind him why democracy was invented. The smell. Let's talk about it. Because you can't talk about bunkhouses without mentioning the smell. No showers. No running water. No ventilation. Sweat, smoke, wet wool, and 50 pairs of boots slowly rotting by the stove. Add in stew made from salt pork and beans that had been reb-oiled for 3 weeks, and you've got a perfume worthy of a war crime. But the men got used to it. They said you could tell a real lumberjack by whether he could sleep through the smell. One visitor to a Maine logging camp in 1885 wrote that the air inside a bunkhouse had a thickness to it, like fog. Another described it as the smell of work and regret. Accurate. The food, if you can call it that, meals were simple. If it could be boiled, fried, or drowned in syrup, it was on the menu. Breakfast was the big one: beans, bacon, flapjacks, coffee that could strip paint, and maybe some molasses if you were fancy. Lunch was eaten standing up in the woods, usually cold leftovers from breakfast, frozen solid by noon. Dinner? The same thing again with more beans. But the cook, the cookie, as they called him, was untouchable. Insult the cook, and you might find a few surprises in your stew. Every camp had stories about men who pushed their luck and got a mouthful of dishwater for dessert. Yet, despite it all, food was comfort. When you're burning 6,000 calories a day just swinging an axe, you don't complain about flavor. The entertainment. Now, what did these men do after work? You'd think they'd just collapse. But no, they were social creatures. Loud ones. After dinner, the bunkhouse came alive. Men smoked, played cards, told stories, and argued about everything. Politics, religion, women, though most hadn't seen one in months. Fights were common. Affection was rare, but real. There was singing, too, slow, lonely songs about rivers and mothers and the endless forest. They'd whittle things, spoons, pipes, or sometimes just random sticks. One man's masterpiece was another's kindling, and in between all that, they complained. Constantly. About the cold, the boss, the food, the fleas. It was almost comforting, like a communal hobby. Company towns and the price of trees. Of course, lumberjacks didn't exactly own their bunkhouses. The companies did, and they ran everything. You were paid by the log, but your pay went straight to the company store. You bought your boots, your food, your tobacco, all from the same place that employed you. If that sounds suspiciously like feudalism, that's because it was. Men would leave camp at the end of winter with almost nothing to show for it, except a new cough, a scar, and a burning desire to do it all again next year. Because somehow, the work got into their blood. The rhythm of it, the creak of the axe, the crash of the trees, the camaraderie of shared misery became addictive. Frozen faith and wooden dreams. There's something almost spiritual about how these men survived. The world outside was frozen and wild, and their bunkhouse, drafty, smoky, miserable, was still a haven. They carved names into the walls, left behind initials and crude jokes, little marks of human existence in a place that could swallow them whole. Sometimes, a man would disappear into the woods and never come back. No one said much. They just filled his bunk and carried on. Because in the lumber camps, survival wasn't dramatic. It was routine. You endured because that's what everyone else did. Culture of cold and code. By the late 19th century, bunkhouse culture was so distinct that outsiders could spot a lumberjack anywhere. The slang, the songs, the walk, even the smell. They had their own code. Don't mess with another man's axe. Don't sit on someone else's bunk. And never, ever mock the cook's flapjacks. Many couldn't read or write, but they knew the language of the woods, the creak of a falling tree, the call of a sawyer yelling, timber, the sharp ring of steel on pine. When spring came and the thaw began, camps would empty. The men drifted to towns, looking strange and feral among the civilized. They drank, gambled, fought, and slept, sometimes all at once. And when winter came again, they went back north. Because the forest called. And the bunkhouse, miserable as it was, felt like home. From axes to chainsaws. As the 20th century rolled in, the age of the great bunkhouse began to fade. Railroads, trucks, and mechanized saws changed everything. Logging camps got smaller, more mobile. Tents replaced log bunkhouses. The romance of the old lumberjack, if you could call life romantic, gave way to modern efficiency. Still, the legend stuck. Tall tales of Paul Bunyan, of oxen the size of barns, of men so strong they could wrestle pine trees. Those stories weren't about truth. They were about identity, the idea that humans could tame nature, or at least survive its tantrums. And somewhere out there, in the ruins of an old camp, you can still find the rotting bones of a bunkhouse. Half buried under moss, logs split and gray, stove rusted through. A ghost of a time when survival was simple and simplicity was brutal. Let's float, now, to another kind of cold, another world of wood, sweat, and stubbornness. Next up, we'll drift into the early Canadian frontier, where lumberjacks weren't just workers, they were part of a national identity in flannel. Because if you thought American bunkhouses were grim, oh Canada. Chapter 2, The Canadian Camps. The northern forests of Canada were another world entirely. Colder, wilder, and somehow even lonelier. The Americans at least had towns nearby, some promise of a warm saloon waiting a few days' walk away. In Canada, the nearest civilization might be 100 miles of snow and regret away. And yet men went. Thousands of them. French Canadians, Scots, Irish, Finns, all drawn by the promise of a steady wage and all equally unprepared for what awaited them. The logging companies had moved north in the 1800s, chasing the great white pines that once blanketed Ontario and Quebec. They wanted tall trees, straight trunks, and endless acres. And they got them, at the cost of human misery measured in frostbite and bad soup. Winter on purpose. The thing about logging in Canada is that it was done in the worst season imaginable. Winter. On purpose. Because frozen ground meant you could haul logs across it without sinking into mud. Ice was an ally, slick, solid, and cold enough to keep everything moving. So when most people huddled indoors, the loggers came alive. They built roads out of packed snow. They dragged trees across frozen lakes. And they did it all while the temperature sat somewhere around, "Why are you outside?" At night, they crawled into their bunkhouses, the same creaking log boxes you saw in the States, only colder and even less ventilated. French-Canadian flair. The French-Canadian lumberjacks, or les bûcherons, gave the camps a bit of character. They were tough, cheerful, and fond of singing, mostly because it was the only entertainment available that didn't involve fighting or frostbite. They'd belt out work songs, called chansons à répondre, with one man leading and the others responding in a chorus that echoed through the snow. It was rhythmic, hypnotic, a way to keep time, stay warm, and remind themselves they were still human. They joked that the music kept the wolves away. More likely, it kept the men from going insane. The songs were about women, rivers, and home, things that felt impossibly far away. Sometimes, a man would hum softly to himself while chopping, the same tune looping all day like a lullaby against the wind. The camps as kingdoms. Each lumber camp was like a tiny kingdom, cut off from the world. The boss was king, the cook was priest, and everyone else was somewhere between serf and snowman. The boss, or foreman, usually walked around with the air of someone who'd stopped feeling joy around 1830. He handled payroll, discipline, and the occasional brawl. And because there was nowhere else to go, everyone obeyed him. Rules were simple: no fighting during work hours, no stealing another man's tobacco, and no complaining about the food unless you wanted to eat it cold. Violence was common, though strangely brief. A disagreement about card games or bunks might end with 2 black eyes and a handshake. There wasn't much point holding grudges when you'd be stuck in the same room for another 4 months. A feast of beans and bacon. Canadian camps weren't much better in the culinary department. Beans, pork, and bread were still the foundation of every meal, with tea standing in for coffee, though it tasted roughly the same, like regret and metal. But Canadians, ever practical, learned to add variety. They threw in potatoes when they could get them, salt fish if they were near the coast, and syrup whenever possible. Because sugar, as everyone knew, could hide the flavor of despair. One favorite dish was pea soup, thick enough to stand a spoon in. Another was something they just called pork grease gravy. It was exactly what it sounded like. The cook, once again, ruled supreme. You could insult the foreman and live. Insult the cook, and you'd find your bread mysteriously soaked in dishwater. Frostbite as a lifestyle. Every man in those camps carried scars from the cold. Toes, fingers, ears. Frostbite wasn't rare. It was seasonal. There are records of men who'd wake up and find their boots frozen to the floorboards. Some tried sleeping with their socks on near the stove, only to have the socks catch fire. Frostbite was accepted the way modern people accept traffic jams. Unpleasant, unavoidable, and somehow always your own fault. The tough ones bragged about it. Lost 3 toes last winter, they'd say proudly. Like it was a badge of honor. Because out there, pain meant you were still alive. Letters home, sort of. Most lumberjacks couldn't write much, but some managed to send letters. They'd dictate them to someone who could, usually the camp clerk or a sympathetic cook. They all said roughly the same thing: "I'm alive, it's cold, send socks." The women back home must have read those letters with a mix of pride and exhaustion. They knew what the work was like. They knew that men went into the woods every winter and came back with less of themselves, fewer teeth, less patience, maybe a new limp. But it was money. Enough to feed a family, pay a debt, maybe buy a small farm. So they kept going back. The silence of the woods. What's often forgotten is how quiet it all was. The woods could swallow sound completely. After a snowfall, you could hear your own heartbeat. Men spoke in low voices, partly from exhaustion and partly because shouting felt rude in a place so vast. The only real noise came from work, the rhythmic thud of axes, the squeal of sleds, the crash of a tree falling. For a few seconds after each fall, the world went perfectly still again, as if holding its breath. It's hard to imagine now, in a world that never shuts up, what that silence must have felt like. Peaceful. Or maybe just eerie. Accidents were normal. The work was brutal, and accidents were as common as splinters. A wrong swing, a bad rope, a patch of ice, that's all it took. There was no medical care. The camp doctor was a bottle of whiskey and a friend with a knife. If a man got hurt, he either recovered or didn't. There was no in-between. Sometimes they buried him right there, between the stumps, with a rough cross carved out of scrap wood. And then they went back to work. Because the trees weren't going to stop falling. It sounds cruel now, but that was just the rhythm of things. Life didn't pause. The spring drives. When winter ended, the real chaos began. The log drives, where men floated the felled trees down rivers toward the mills, were legendary. Picture hundreds of logs bouncing through rapids, men running across them like circus performers with axes for balance poles. It was beautiful in a suicidal kind of way. The drivers, called river pigs, were the daredevils of the lumber world. They danced on water, kept jams clear, and occasionally vanished under the current, forever part of the timber they rode. They sang while they worked, loud, defiant songs that echoed down the valleys. Because fear didn't help, and singing at least gave you rhythm. The Canadian timber barons. Of course, behind every romantic tale of lumberjack heroism was a very comfortable man in a very warm office. The timber barons. They owned the forests, the mills, and, effectively, the men. They lived in cities like Montreal or Ottawa, far from the frostbite and the boredom. They built mansions while their workers built bunkhouses. And they justified it by saying the men loved the work. Which, technically, some did. In the same way some people claim to love their toxic exes, it's complicated. These barons saw themselves as pioneers of progress. They turned trees into empire. And they never once slept in a bunkhouse. Religion, sort of. Out in the camps, faith was as patchy as the firewood. Some men carried little crosses or rosaries. Others just swore by their boots and the stove. Priests sometimes visited in winter, trudging through the snow to hold mass. They'd bless the camp, sprinkle a little holy water, then probably run for their lives. Religion out there was less about salvation and more about survival. If your bunkmate sneezed and didn't die, that was miracle enough. Women of the woods. Few women ever saw the inside of a bunkhouse, and honestly, that was for the best. But they were part of the story all the same. Wives, mothers, sisters, the invisible infrastructure of every lumberjack's life. They managed the farms, raised the children, and waited for the spring thaw. When the men came home, half wild and half broke, the women took them back anyway. Because that was the rhythm of the North. Hard work, long winters, and short summers filled with mosquitoes and forgiveness. The ghosts left behind. Many of those camps are gone now. Swallowed by forest or turned into museum exhibits. But sometimes, hikers stumble across the remains. An old stove, a broken saw, a pile of moss-covered logs that once held 100 dreams. Locals swear you can still hear singing on still nights. Not haunting, just the echoes of men keeping rhythm with the cold. Because they didn't just survive the woods. They became part of them. Let's float again, this time to a different kind of camp, the ones built not by lumberjacks, but by railroad crews pushing tracks through the same frozen wilderness. Different tools, same misery. Chapter 3, The Railroad Camps and the Iron North. The forests didn't stay silent for long, because after the lumbermen came another breed of winter wanderer, the railroad crews. Different job, same level of discomfort. The 19th century had decided that what the continent really needed was more iron. Iron rails, iron bridges, iron will. And so, men with shovels, picks, and a vague idea of engineering were sent into the wilderness to make it happen. If lumberjacks were romantics of the forest, these men were its dentists, pulling, blasting, and hammering until something straight and metallic appeared where nature used to be. They were called navvies, short for navigators, though most couldn't navigate beyond the next tent flap. Immigrants mostly Irish, Chinese, Scandinavians, each bringing their own methods of surviving the unending mud, frost, and bad leadership. Tracks across nowhere. Imagine it. A line of men, black silhouettes against white snow, laying rails across a landscape that looked like it actively wanted them gone. The camps popped up like mushrooms, rough shelters, hastily built, and destined to blow away in the next storm. Tents if you were lucky. Log huts if someone had the energy. Always crowded, always damp, always a little louder than necessary. The workday began before dawn, because the sun didn't care about union rules. They dug, blasted rock, dragged ties, and hammered spikes with the kind of mechanical rhythm that would make a metronome weep. And through it all, the cold hung in the air like a second atmosphere. Frost clung to mustaches. Beards turned white before noon. Tea froze before it could cool. Still, they kept going, because every mile of track meant pay, small, late, and often spent on the same whiskey that caused most of the day's arguments. Life in the camps. Railroad camps were less bunkhouse and more temporary fever dream. Picture a few dozen tents huddled together like penguins, each filled with the usual cast of exhausted men and questionable stew. Sleeping arrangements were creative. Some had cots. Most had straw on frozen ground. A few just passed out near the stove and hoped the rats respected personal space. The air was thick with smoke, curses, and the faint scent of cheap tobacco. Bathing was theoretical. Shaving was suicide. You'd lose your skin to the cold. They ate whatever could be cooked fast and in bulk: beans, salt pork, bread, potatoes if anyone remembered to buy them. Sometimes there was pie, which caused near-religious devotion. Every camp had a cook who swore at everyone equally, a foreman who thought yelling louder meant leadership, and at least one guy who could play a fiddle badly but enthusiastically. At night, they sang or fought or both. The line between camaraderie and chaos was thin, usually marked by a tipped whiskey bottle. The Chinese workers. On the western side of the continent, the story changed shape. In Canada and the United States, Chinese laborers built vast sections of track through the mountains, cheap, quiet, and expendable in the eyes of the men who paid them. They were efficient, disciplined, and endlessly patient, virtues that didn't help much when avalanches and dynamite blasts erased entire crews overnight. The camps they lived in were separate, smaller, cleaner, and strangely more peaceful than the others. They cooked rice, vegetables, and dried fish, brewed tea instead of whiskey, and managed to avoid dying of scurvy, which confused everyone else immensely. Still, they were treated as outsiders. They were paid less, blamed more, and spoken of as if they were part of the machinery. And yet, without them, the iron lines would never have reached the coast. It's one of history's quieter truths. The railroads were built on endurance, not glory. And the men who endured the most rarely got their names recorded. The foreman and the fury. The foremen of these camps were cut from a special kind of stubborn cloth. Usually ex-soldiers or men who'd run out of other ways to yell at people professionally. They paced the tracks with clipboards, shouting at anyone not moving fast enough. They had the authority of minor gods, tempered only by the occasional mutiny. Pay disputes were constant. So were injuries. You could lose a finger before breakfast and still be expected to swing a hammer by lunch. And when workers did strike, the bosses simply found new men. There was always someone desperate enough to work for a bowl of stew and the privilege of frostbite. Progress, as they like to call it, was built one splintered hand at a time. Explosions were normal. Blasting through rock was the hardest part. Before dynamite became common, they used black powder, a charming substance that either worked perfectly or not at all, with no warning. Men would pack holes with powder, light fuses, and sprint for their lives. Sometimes the charge went off early. Sometimes it didn't go off at all, until someone poked it later with a shovel. They called it Hell's Lottery. And everyone had a ticket. Those who survived wore their scars like medals. Those who didn't got a quick burial and a new man in their place before sunset. Efficiency above all. Railroad towns. Wherever the tracks went, small towns followed. Half real, half hallucination. Saloons, general stores, and what polite historians call houses of entertainment. These towns were rough. Population, transient. Law enforcement, theoretical. The moment payday arrived, so did chaos. Whiskey flowed, tempers rose, and fights broke out over cards, women, or just the audacity of someone breathing too loudly. By Monday, half the men were broke and the other half were missing teeth. Then the trains moved on, and the town went silent again, waiting for the next wave of tired dreamers with shovels. The winter that never ended. The thing about the northern rail lines was that they didn't stop for winter. Snow just became another obstacle to shovel. Men dug through drifts taller than themselves, clearing tracks one scoop at a time. Snowplows were pulled by horses, which occasionally froze in place and had to be thawed like furniture. Trains froze too. Locomotives coated in ice like sculptures. Boilers cracking, wheels locked solid. And yet, the schedule had to be kept, because time, apparently, was more important than human survival. There's a story from Manitoba, 1888, a crew that kept a train moving through a blizzard for 4 straight days. Half the men couldn't see by the end, their eyes frozen nearly shut. They made it to the next station anyway. Then promptly fell asleep in the snow, because beds were a luxury for people who didn't hallucinate icicles. Sleeping beside the rails. Rest was a formality. Men slept where they fell, beside the tracks, in tents, sometimes in the very boxcars they'd been unloading all day. Blankets were thin. Dreams were mostly about warmth. There's a kind of exhaustion that becomes almost spiritual, where you stop feeling tired and start feeling like part of the landscape. That was railroad fatigue, a merging of man and snowdrift. Sometimes, in letters home, men described it as peaceful, which is one of those words people use when they mean numb. Building the last spikes. When the final sections of track were finished, there was usually a ceremony, politicians in top hats, photographers, speeches about progress. The workers stood in the background, covered in soot, unshaven, trying not to fall asleep during the speeches. Then they went back to packing up camp, because the job was done and someone else would soon be laying track somewhere colder. The last spike ceremonies became famous, symbols of national unity and triumph. But the men who held the hammers knew better. They hadn't built unity. They'd built survival, one frozen nail at a time. After the rails. When the railroads were finally finished, the men scattered. Some became farmers. Some joined new construction crews. A few, predictably, just kept walking until they found another wilderness to argue with. The tracks they'd laid carried goods, people, and ideas across the continent, but they also carried ghosts. Every curve and bridge had a story buried beneath it. Stories of frostbite, laughter, and the quiet kind of endurance that never makes it into textbooks. The camps vanished, reclaimed by trees and moss, same as the old bunkhouses. But if you listen near certain stretches of track at night, the wind sounds suspiciously like hammers on steel. Rhythmic, steady, unending. The sound of men who refused to stop moving forward, even when the world froze around them. Let's drift now from iron rails to something a little softer, though not by much. Next, we'll wander into the logging towns that grew out of those old camps, the places where rough men tried, with varying success, to become civilized. Chapter 4. The The logging towns, civilization in flannel. Civilization is a strong word, but that's what they called it. When the forests began to thin and the railroads stretched their shiny arms through the wilderness, people started building towns, or, more accurately, clusters of ambition and mud. They called them things like Timber Falls, Pine Creek, or Mill Junction, names that sounded rustic and proud, but usually translated to place where we built a saloon first. These logging towns were strange hybrids. Half wild camp, half respectable community, where a man could spend 6 months felling trees, and the next 6 pretending he was a gentleman until winter rolled around again. The birth of a boomtown. It always started the same way, a sawmill. The sawmill was the heart of every settlement, roaring, shrieking, throwing sawdust into every possible direction, including your breakfast. Around it sprouted the essentials of early civilization, a company store that charged too much, a saloon that opened too early, and a boarding house that was optimistic about hygiene. Then came the church, built mostly to make the saloon owner feel guilty, followed by a schoolhouse that doubled as a dance hall, courtroom, and general argument arena. Every town had the same story: hope, timber, and noise. So much noise. Saws running day and night, trains arriving with more logs, more men, more whiskey. And then, of course, came the women who civilized the chaos. The arrival of women changed everything, slowly, but inevitably. They came as wives, widows, teachers, cooks, or, depending on the establishment, entertainers. Some opened boarding houses, where for a small fortune you could rent a bed without frostbite. Others ran laundries or bakeries, small miracles of cleanliness and comfort in places that had known only mud and beans. And the men didn't quite know what to do with themselves. Suddenly, shaving became a social act. Language softened slightly, and fights outside the saloon were occasionally interrupted by someone shouting, "Not in front of the schoolteacher." Women wrote letters home describing these towns as energetic, which was a polite 19th century synonym for chaotic but improving. It's fair to say they built more civilization with soap and conversation than the men ever did with hammers. The saloon and the store. Every frontier town had 2 major powers, the storekeeper and the saloon keeper, and both were more dangerous than frostbite. The store was where you bought everything: clothes, food, tools, gossip, and crippling debt, because the company's system didn't vanish with the camps. You might get paid in cash now, but somehow it all drifted back to the man behind the counter. The saloon, on the other hand, was the town's emotional core. It's where men celebrated paydays, mourned injuries, and loudly promised to give up drinking right after one more drink. The floors were sticky, the music was out of tune, and the chairs had all been repaired at least twice with whatever wasn't nailed down. And yet, on Saturday nights, it was the most alive place in the wilderness. Pianos arrived by train, played by musicians who claimed to have performed in Chicago but were more likely fleeing it. Card games went on for days. And occasionally so did the arguments. The sheriff, if there was one, usually stayed home. Experience had taught him that fights tended to solve themselves, or at least exhaust themselves. Sunday morning contradictions. After every Saturday night of howling and glass breaking came the quiet dignity of Sunday morning. Men stumbling to church in wrinkled shirts, pretending they hadn't just been brawling 12 hours earlier. The preacher's sermons were usually about sin, temptation, and the wages of vice, all of which were currently napping in the back pew. But people came anyway, because even lumberjacks and rail hands liked to believe that civilization was possible, at least for an hour. Sometimes the choir sang so off-key it could strip paint, but that was part of the charm. And afterward, everyone went back to their usual routine of coffee, gossip, and ignoring the preacher's advice. Sawdust and society. Sawdust was everywhere. It floated through the air like a dry snowstorm, got into food, hair, clothes, lungs. It was the smell of work, harsh, sharp, oddly comforting. And it coated everything the way civilization always does, thinly and temporarily, because these towns, for all their progress, were still fragile. A fire could erase them overnight. Many did. Sawdust and open flames were not friends. Neither were whiskey and lanterns. Whole towns went up in minutes. the sawmill roaring louder than ever, but only for one final, glorious scream. Then silence, then ash, and by the next season, someone was already rebuilding. Because that's what frontier people did. They rebuilt. And they never quite learned to stop using sawdust as insulation. Respectability arrives, reluctantly. Over time, some of these rough settlements grew respectable, or at least developed better manners for their misbehavior. Roads got names. Houses got paint. The saloon added curtains. There were town councils, elections, and the occasional scandal involving missing funds and mysteriously upgraded boots. Schools improved. Children appeared in groups larger than one. The sound of laughter replaced the constant hammering of saws, at least on Sundays. And the men who'd once slept in bunkhouses found themselves awkwardly attending church picnics, trying to remember how forks worked. Progress looked strange on them, like dressing a bear in a waistcoat. But they tried. Mostly. The endless logging season. Even as the towns grew, the rhythm of the forest still ruled everything. Winter meant logging. Spring meant the drives. Summer meant milling and construction. Autumn meant waiting for it all to start again. The forests kept shrinking, though no one wanted to admit it. People spoke of the trees as if they were infinite. They weren't. Some towns cut themselves right out of existence, quite literally. They harvested every tree within reach, then looked around and realized there was nothing left to log. And so, they packed up, boarded trains, and moved north, chasing the next line of untouched forest. Civilization, it seemed, was portable. The oddities of frontier life. Life in these towns had a kind of rustic absurdity to it. You could attend a dance in the schoolhouse one night and the next morning watch the same building double as a courtroom for a man accused of stealing beans. Holidays were excuses for collective nonsense. Christmas meant overcooked ham, unwashed flannel, and someone inevitably setting the tree on fire. New Year's meant resolutions no one kept. And every spring thaw brought the same ritual, watching the river break up and wondering how many logs would make it to the mill this time. Entertainment was scarce, so people made their own. Amateur theater, storytelling nights, spelling bees that devolved into debates about grammar and whiskey. It was messy, but human. Letters and loneliness. Even in the bustle, loneliness lingered. The men who'd once lived months in bunkhouses found it hard to adjust to conversation that wasn't shouted over axes or wind. Some wrote letters, slow, awkward things that tried to sound optimistic. "I'm doing fine," they'd write, and the sawmill's still standing for now. Women wrote back about crops, weather, children, and gossip, the currency of small-town life. Those letters were the glue of the frontier. Paper bridges across vast stretches of wilderness. Many never arrived. Some burned in fires or were lost in floods. But the act of writing them mattered more than the reading. It meant you still believed someone was listening. Decline in slow motion. As the 20th century crept closer, the great forests began to vanish. The towns that had thrived on timber started to fade. Mills closed, rail lines shifted, and the once bustling streets grew quiet. Some towns reinvented themselves as farming centers. Others as tourist traps, selling nostalgia for the very hardship they once escaped. The old-timers sat on porches, watching the children play in streets that used to be sawdust and shouting. They told stories of the old days, conveniently forgetting the lice, the cold, and the endless beans. Memory, like sawdust, softens everything. The ghosts in the wood grain. Today, you can still find remnants of those towns if you wander far enough north. A weathered church steeple. A mill foundation swallowed by weeds. A broken sign pointing toward a place that no longer exists. Some locals say they can hear the echo of saws on still mornings, faint and rhythmic, the heartbeat of a town that refuses to vanish completely. Because the truth is, civilization doesn't end. It just gets quieter. It fades into the trees until you can't tell where the forest stops and the past begins. Let's drift now to the people who came next. Not loggers, not rail hands, but the families who stayed behind. The ones who tried to make the wilderness into something resembling home. Because chopping trees was easy. Raising children in the middle of nowhere? That was the real endurance test. Chapter 5. The families who stayed, women, children, and the quiet frontier. The noise faded first. That endless hammering, sawing, shouting. It didn't stop all at once, but it thinned, like smoke rising until it vanished. And when it did, what was left were the families. The women who decided they'd had enough of moving camps every season. The children who had never known anything beyond pine trees and muddy streets. And the handful of men who realized, reluctantly, that stability wasn't a disease. The forest towns that survived logging's decline did so because someone decided to stay, not because there was still profit, but because there was comfort in routine, even a meager one. The women who refused to leave. It was often the women who made the decision. Men would have chased the next forest until they fell into the ocean. But the women had other priorities, schools, neighbors, and walls that didn't blow away in winter storms. They'd had enough of packing up every few years, of sleeping in drafty shacks, of watching children grow up without a sense of home. So they planted gardens where sawdust used to be, built fences that actually marked ownership, and convinced the local men that painting a house wasn't unmanly. They turned frontier towns into something resembling civilization, not with grand gestures, but with small acts, curtains, casseroles, and rules about wiping boots before coming inside. It's strange how permanence begins. Usually with a flower pot and someone saying, "I think I'll stay." Domesticating the wilderness. Domestic life in early timber towns was not glamorous. Most homes were 1 or 2 rooms, drafty in winter, swampy in summer, and always within smelling distance of something unpleasant. Chimneys smoked, roofs leaked, and mice treated pantries as public property. But the women made it work. They scrubbed, sewed, baked, and scolded. They grew herbs in coffee cans and made butter with a hand crank that squeaked like it was complaining. Children were everywhere. Dirty, noisy, perpetually bruised, but alive, small miracles in wool socks and second-hand sweaters. The forest that had once been a place of labor became, slowly, a backyard. A place for berry picking and tree climbing instead of logging. A different kind of relationship between people and the land, less about conquest, more about coexistence. The men who stayed behind. The men who remained were an odd mix. Some were too old to chase new work. Some were too stubborn to admit defeat. And some discovered, surprisingly, that they liked waking up in the same bed more than they liked swinging an axe at dawn. They became farmers, carpenters, mechanics, and postmasters. Jobs that didn't require frostbite or risk of falling trees. A few struggled with the change. They missed the adrenaline, the camaraderie of danger, the simplicity of bunkhouse life. Settling down felt like a kind of death. But routine has a quiet mercy. A man could learn to enjoy small things, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of his children chasing chickens, the warmth of a stove that didn't come from burning pine tar. The forest no longer ruled their lives, but its presence lingered, a constant hum at the edge of memory. Childhood in the leftover towns. For the first generation born after the logging boom, the forest wasn't a workplace, it was a playground. They built forts out of rotting planks, played logging camp with sticks for axes, and dared each other to explore the old mill ruins that everyone swore were haunted. School was a one-room affair. A dozen kids of every age, all terrified of the teacher's ruler and equally bored by arithmetic. Discipline was strict, but affection ran deep. Teachers were often the most educated people for 100 miles, which meant they were also the most overworked and underpaid. They taught reading, writing, and occasionally, the fine art of staying awake through the winter. At home, chores filled the rest of the day. Feeding chickens, chopping kindling, hauling water because plumbing was still a distant rumor. Children grew up fast out here, but they also grew tough, curious, and oddly content. They didn't have much, but they didn't know that yet. The Sunday rhythm. Sundays became the backbone of the week. A break from work, a reminder that life could be about something other than survival. The church bell rang, sometimes out of tune, but nobody minded. Families dressed in their best, which usually meant the least patched clothes available, and walked dusty roads toward a building that doubled as both spiritual refuge and social hub. The sermons were long, the benches hard, and the children restless. But afterward came the potluck. And that was worth every minute of righteous discomfort. Tables groaned under pies, pickles, and anything that could be fried or preserved. People shared gossip disguised as concern. Someone played a fiddle, badly, and for a few hours, everyone forgot how isolated they really were. That's how small towns survived, not through prosperity, but through potlucks. The quiet work of holding on. There's a kind of heroism in monotony. The kind that doesn't make history books because it isn't dramatic enough. No battles, no revolutions, just the daily act of keeping things together. Women mended, cooked, and prayed. Men built, fixed, and worried. Children learned, played, and eventually left. The rhythm of these lives was slow but steady, the sound of sweeping floors, chopping wood, hanging laundry, boiling water. If you listened closely, you could almost hear civilization breathing. They didn't see themselves as pioneers anymore. They were just people trying to make a place livable, which, in its own quiet way, was harder than conquering a forest. Letters, diaries, and the dream of elsewhere. Even in settled towns, loneliness persisted, the kind that seeps into long winters and lingers over cold coffee. Many women kept diaries, not for posterity, but for sanity. Pages filled with weather notes, half-remembered recipes, and the occasional cry for company disguised as poetry. Some wrote letters to sisters or friends back east, describing the latest baby, the new stove, the endless mud. The letters took weeks to arrive, if at all. Replies were treasures, read until the paper wore thin. For some, those letters were the only proof that the wider world still existed. A reminder that beyond the trees, there were cities with streetlights and theaters and noise that wasn't made by wind or wolves. And yet, few of them actually left. Dreaming of elsewhere was easier than starting over again. Seasons and survival. The passing of seasons marked time more than calendars ever did. Spring meant mud, rivers swelling, roads dissolving, everything smelling faintly of rot and optimism. Summer brought black flies and a brief illusion of warmth. Autumn was a frenzy of canning, chopping, stacking, and praying the roof would hold. And winter? Well, winter was eternal. Snow piled up until houses looked like half-buried secrets. Windows frosted from the inside. And nights stretched so long that time itself seemed to hibernate. But people adapted. They told stories, played cards, darned socks, and waited for daylight like it was a miracle. And when the thaw finally came, they stepped outside and remembered why they stayed. Because even the hardest places are beautiful when you survive them. The town's slow heartbeat. By the early 1900s, many of these towns were ghosts in waiting. The mills were gone, the trains ran less often, but life persisted in smaller, quieter ways. The general store sold more gossip than goods. The blacksmith's forge now made hinges instead of horseshoes. And every child's dream was to move somewhere with sidewalks. But every evening, smoke still rose from chimneys. Lanterns still glowed in windows. And someone still sat on a porch, watching the trees sway and thinking about the old days. Progress had passed them by, but they didn't seem to mind. They had roofs, food, and company. And after a century of noise, the silence felt like luxury. Endurance in miniature. It's easy to overlook these people, the ones who stayed put instead of making history. But their quiet endurance is what kept the frontier from vanishing entirely. They weren't heroes or villains, just caretakers. Of houses, of families, of fading towns that still deserved to exist. Every nail hammered into a new fence, every loaf baked on a wood stove, every bedtime story whispered under leaky roofs. All of it was an act of resistance against emptiness. And though they never saw themselves as builders of history, they were the ones who gave the wilderness its last shape. Let's drift next into the heart of that endurance, how the myth of the lumberjack became legend long after the real men and women were gone. Because while the people faded, the stories didn't. And sometimes, the tales told by survivors become the truest kind of history. Chapter 6. The Myth of the Lumberjack. Tall Tales, Songs, and the Invention of Paul Bunyan. When the real lumberjacks packed up their axes and disappeared into memory, their ghosts didn't stay quiet. They just got taller, and stronger, and a little bit ridiculous. Because that's what happens when history goes to sleep. it starts to dream. What began as quiet stories told around bunkhouse fires turned into some of North America's most absurd legends. Men so big they needed whole rivers for bathtubs, oxen that could plow the sky, and winters so cold that words froze before you could finish a sentence. It was the great age of tall tales, when exhaustion, whiskey, and loneliness combined to form the first truly American mythology. The birth of the Bunyan type. Before Paul Bunyan had a name, there were 1,000 nameless strongmen. Stories drifted from camp to camp, each crew swearing they'd once worked beside a man who could chop trees faster than steam, faster than logic, faster than anyone should want to. Some said he could clear 40 acres before breakfast. Others said he wrestled bears for sport, and usually won, though not always without an apology afterward. These stories weren't meant to be believed. They were meant to be told slowly between pipe puffs and creaking bunks, while the wind howled outside. A good tall tale was like a warm blanket, full of holes, but comforting. And the best storytellers were the quiet ones, the men who'd seen too much winter and had learned that truth, on its own, was rarely entertaining. Why they needed myths. Logging was brutal, monotonous, and occasionally fatal. Men needed something to make sense of it, to turn endless labor into something grander. So they invented giants. Not the cruel, storybook kind, but big-hearted, slow-talking, impossible men who made the wilderness seem smaller. Paul Bunyan became the embodiment of everything loggers wanted to believe about themselves: strong, tireless, good-natured, and slightly ridiculous. He was every man's brag and every man's dream of purpose. He could do everything they couldn't, and because of that, he made their exhaustion feel noble. It's easier to swing an axe all day if you can imagine you're part of a legend instead of a payroll. The spread of the stories. The earliest Bunyan tales weren't written down. They were passed like gossip, reshaped, exaggerated, and improved with every retelling. A man might hear one version in Minnesota and another in Ontario, each with new feats, new sidekicks, and new catastrophes. In one, Bunyan dug the Great Lakes to water his blue ox, Babe. In another, he created Mount Hood by shaking mud off his boots. Geography was optional. Physics was politely ignored. And somehow, the more absurd the story got, the more people loved it. Because the frontier was already absurd: endless trees, endless cold, endless isolation. The myth just made it feel funny instead of cruel. Babe the Blue Ox. Symbolism by accident. No one really knows where Babe came from. Some say he began as a metaphor for winter itself, that relentless blue chill that followed loggers everywhere. Others say it was just a silly joke that stuck. But once the giant ox entered the stories, everything changed. Babe balanced out Bunyan's loneliness. He was loyal, stubborn, huge, and oddly comforting, like a pet, a partner, and a metaphor rolled into one enormous beast. Together, they could do anything: drag whole forests to the mill, stamp rivers into existence, flatten mountains because the view was better that way. They were the working man's version of gods, rough, friendly, and always slightly clumsy. Storytelling as survival. Every bunkhouse had its storyteller. The quiet man who'd wait until the lamps were low and then start talking, slow and measured. He'd tell about Bunyan's snow shoveling contests, about pancakes so big they needed oxen to flip them, about mosquitoes so enormous they had to be fought with axes. The other men would laugh softly, not because they believed it, but because for a few minutes, the cold didn't matter. Tall tales were warmth. They made sense of endless hardship by turning it into comedy. And in places where laughter was rare, that made them sacred. Even the most skeptical men would nod along and mutter, "Yeah, I worked with a feller like that once," because admitting you hadn't would make you feel small. When business discovered the legend, then came the 1910s, and with them, advertising. Because of course it did. A lumber company in Michigan realized that Paul Bunyan made excellent copy. They printed booklets full of tall tales and handed them out at trade shows, turning a folklore hero into a mascot. Suddenly, Bunyan had a standardized look: big beard, plaid shirt, suspenders, the fashion icon of logging. He wasn't just a myth anymore, he was branding. Children's books followed, softening him into a kind of giant teddy bear with an axe. By the 1920s, he'd gone from bunkhouse exaggeration to national cartoon. And yet, something genuine remained in him. A spark of the lonely humor that had created him in the first place. Songs of the camps. If you'd walked through a logging camp in the 1880s, you might have heard singing, low, tired, half in tune. Songs about whiskey, lost wages, and trees that fell the wrong way. The most famous lumberjack ballads weren't cheerful. They were melancholy, with a touch of irony, like men trying to laugh through frostbite. Once more to the woods, boys, they'd sing, once more to the cold and the pine. We'll chop till we're ghosts, boys, and call that a fine time. Music made the repetition bearable. It turned misery into rhythm, and it bound men together in a kind of accidental brotherhood, a choir of exhaustion. When Bunyan entered those songs, he fit perfectly. He was the ideal chorus, the man who could swing an axe and sing about it at the same time. The myth becomes memory. By the mid-20th century, few people remembered real logging life. Machines had taken over, and forests had become parks instead of livelihoods. But Paul Bunyan lived on, not as history, but as nostalgia. He stood tall in roadside statues, smiling beside blue fiberglass oxen, welcoming tourists to towns that no longer smelled of pine and sweat. He was history repackaged as comfort, the myth of hard work without the blisters, adventure without the frostbite. And maybe that's why he endured, because he wasn't really about logging anymore. He was about remembering that once, ordinary men survived extraordinary conditions and still found room to laugh. The absurdity of immortality. Today, Bunyan shows up in cartoons, cereal boxes, and car commercials. He's still chopping trees, still smiling, still somehow clean-shaven despite living in the woods. He's been turned into everything except what he actually was. A coping mechanism. A tall tale born from men who needed to make the cold funny so it wouldn't kill them. But maybe that's fine. Every legend has to evolve, or it freezes. And if those old loggers could see him now, 30 feet tall, made of fiberglass, holding a fake axe outside a diner, they'd probably laugh. Because that's exactly how legends should end, not with reverence, but with irony. The real meaning under the flannel. Under all the exaggeration, Bunyan's story is still human. It's about endurance, humor, and the desperate need to make life larger than it feels. He represents a world where work was identity, where strength was the only currency, and where laughter was survival. When people tell his stories today, around campfires, in children's books, or on sleepy podcasts like this one, they're not celebrating fantasy. They're remembering the people who invented it. Because every absurd exaggeration hides a simple truth. The cold was real. The labor was endless. And the men who lived through it deserve to feel like giants, even just in stories. Echoes in the pines. Walk deep enough into any northern forest, and you can still find relics. Rusted saw blades, broken sled runners, old boot soles pressed into the earth. History fades quietly, but not completely. And if you listen closely on a still night, when the wind brushes the pines just right, you might think you hear something, a faint, rhythmic thud. It's not ghosts. It's not giants. It's just memory, still chopping away. Let's float onward next to where those stories went, into the modern age, where nostalgia, tourism, and myth-making turned forgotten labor into cozy legend. Because once the forests were gone, all that was left to harvest were the stories themselves. Chapter 7. The Great Sawdust Age, or How Men Slept in Smoke and Splinters. Now, if you thought the lumberjack's life was rough before, brace yourself, because the Great Sawdust Age was when things got really itchy. Sawdust was everywhere. In the beds, in the food, in the lungs. It clung to the sweat like glitter at a music festival, except no one was dancing, and everyone smelled vaguely of pine tar and regret. By the late 19th century, lumber had become industrial. Big mills were humming, the demand for timber was endless, and the forests were falling faster than a foreman's patience on payday. Lumber camps grew from scattered shacks into something resembling entire pop-up towns, transient, filthy, and somehow always half on fire. The bunkhouses that had once been humble, smoke-filled cabins became slightly larger smoke-filled cabins. Progress, I suppose. The company bunkhouses were often built quickly, logs thrown together with moss for insulation because, sure, what could go wrong with organic filler in a damp, rat-infested building? Inside, rows of bunks lined the walls like honeycombs for men instead of bees. Each man got a narrow berth, maybe 2 feet wide, if he was lucky. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, sawdust, or old moss that hadn't yet molded beyond recognition. And let's just say, bedbugs were thriving. Imagine lying there, exhausted, your back aching from swinging an axe all day, trying to sleep while the guy next to you snores like a sawmill and the lice are having an all-you-can-eat buffet. The air would be thick with smoke from a poorly vented stove and the unmistakable scent of unwashed wool. The floors were rarely swept, so the layer of sawdust underfoot became permanent, part floor, part compost heap. And yet, these men stayed. They stayed because it was better than freezing alone in the woods. The bunkhouse offered heat, bad coffee, and the illusion of community. Nights were loud, full of laughter, card games, bad singing, and someone inevitably carving obscene doodles into the wall. The laughter, though, often hid bone-deep exhaustion. They worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, and Sundays were for mending clothes, sharpening axes, or sleeping through the ache. Let's float for a moment to the kitchen, or cookhouse, as it was known. This was the heart of the camp. Meals weren't gourmet, but they were massive. Pancakes, bacon, beans, bread, and coffee so strong it could dissolve a spoon. The cook was king here. A good cook could make or break a crew's morale. If he kept bellies full, no one complained. If he served burnt mush or weak coffee, though, well, even the mildest lumberjack could turn mutinous. The cookhouse also doubled as a gossip hub. Men would trade stories of near-death experiences, trees that almost crushed them, bears they didn't quite outrun, or the time old Pete tried to shave with a rusty saw blade. There were tall tales, too, about legendary loggers who could fell a pine in 3 strokes or wrestle moose for fun. Hyperbole was currency, and everyone spent freely. But for all their rough edges, lumberjacks had a strange sense of pride and order. Their clothes were filthy but neatly patched. Their boots were worn but oiled. They might curse the company, but they took care of their tools. Axes were treated like family heirlooms, often sharpened with obsessive care. Because out there, a dull axe could kill you faster than a bear, or worse, make you look incompetent. Winter was their main season, when the frozen ground made hauling logs easier. Ironically, it was also the season of endless darkness and cold so sharp it felt personal. Many camps had one tiny window for light, and frost crept over the glass like lace. Inside, men huddled around the stove, playing cards with gloves still on, the sound of wind howling like a banshee outside. Sometimes, when the woodpile ran low, they'd burn parts of broken sleds or even furniture. Nothing was sacred if it could keep them warm. Bathing was infrequent. In theory, there might be a frozen river nearby. In practice, stripping down in sub-zero weather wasn't exactly appealing. So, most men opted for the washcloth and prayer method. Every few weeks, they might trek to a larger town for a real bath, a haircut, and maybe, if they were feeling particularly human, a new shirt. Those nights in town were legendary. They'd drink, gamble, and occasionally brawl, though most fights ended with more laughter than blood. Back in the bunkhouse, evenings sometimes turned philosophical. Someone might mention the sheer absurdity of cutting trees all day just so other men in faraway cities could have fancy furniture or railroad ties. Others would grunt, sip their coffee, and agree. Life was hard, but it was honest. There was a strange nobility in it, even if it didn't feel that way when your socks froze stiff overnight. The bunkhouses also carried an odd camaraderie born from hardship. You might not like the guy beside you, but you'd share your last match if he needed it. You'd help dig him out if he got caught under a fallen tree, no questions asked. The camp was its own little world, a society of exhaustion, resilience, and questionable hygiene. And the funny thing? When spring came and the snow melted, many of these men would leave the camp swearing never to return. Yet, as autumn crept back, they'd drift right in again, lured by habit, necessity, or that strange peace that comes from being far away from everything else. The Great Sawdust Age wasn't glamorous. It was dirty, cold, and endlessly repetitive. But it built more than timber empires. It built the myth of the rugged North American worker. The image of the flannel-clad man with an axe over his shoulder didn't come from advertisements. It came from nights in bunkhouses where men slept in sawdust, smoked their lungs raw, and still got up at dawn because that's just what you did. So yes, it was miserable, but it was also the birthplace of an enduring legend, one forged from splinters, sweat, and the quiet endurance of men who learned to live where even the trees looked tired. Let's drift onward to another camp, one that tried, against all odds, to make bunkhouse life comfortable. Or, well, at least slightly less awful. Chapter 8. Comfort, apparently, when bunkhouses tried to be civilized. By the early 20th century, someone, probably a government inspector with clean hands, decided that maybe, just maybe, living in a glorified smoke box full of lice wasn't ideal. There were murmurs of reform, which, in lumberjack terms, meant a roof that didn't leak quite as much. Camps began to modernize. Slowly, painfully, and usually only when the old bunkhouse burned down, which it frequently did. These new bunkhouses were advertised as comfortable. The kind of comfort where you might not wake up with frost in your beard, luxury. Walls were now sometimes lined with tar paper, the universal sign of progress in rural architecture. Stoves were moved to the center of the room to improve circulation. It didn't work, of course, but it gave the illusion of design. The smoke still found its way into every corner, and your pillows still smelled like burnt bacon by morning. Instead of moss or hay, bunks might have real mattresses filled with horsehair or straw, which sounds decent until you realize horsehair ages about as gracefully as wet rope. Over time, the modern bunkhouse began to resemble a cross between a barracks and a barn. There was order, at least. Rows of iron-framed bunks, nailed-up shelves for personal items, even the occasional lantern instead of a candle jammed in a bottle. Civilization had arrived, barely. Camps also started to hire actual camp clerks, whose job was to handle paperwork, orders, and payroll. In theory, this made things more efficient. In practice, it gave men someone new to dislike. Clerks were usually the only ones with soft hands and clean boots, and that alone made them suspicious. They represented the company, which, in the minds of most loggers, meant the enemy. But these changes were part of a larger trend. As industrial logging grew, companies realized that keeping workers slightly alive for longer was good for profits. So bunkhouses got slightly cleaner, slightly warmer, and slightly less horrific. Companies introduced rules about cleanliness, though cleanliness was interpreted very loosely. One Canadian company proudly reported that it required men to bathe at least once every 2 weeks. In February, in a tin basin, with water that had to be heated over a wood stove. So yes, technically cleaner, spiritually unchanged. The reading room was another innovation. Some camps began to set aside a corner or small cabin where men could sit quietly, read newspapers, or write letters. The problem was few could read beyond the headlines, and most letters home were short and painfully practical. Still alive. Send socks. But it was a noble effort, and the very presence of a bookshelf in a logging camp felt like something monumental. A tiny candle of civilization flickering in a wilderness of profanity and splinters. As for the food, it improved. Slightly. Cooks were trained, or at least sober, and the menus expanded. Fresh bread appeared more often, sometimes even pie. There's a famous saying from an old logger that you could tell the quality of a camp by its pie crust. And it's true. The better the food, the happier the crew. A full stomach made men overlook the drafty bunks and the occasional rat sprinting across their boots. And then came the birth of what was sometimes called the deluxe bunkhouse, usually reserved for foremen or seasoned men. These were actually insulated, maybe even had separate sleeping cubicles. Imagine, privacy, a small shelf, maybe even a pillow that wasn't half mildew. For the first time, some lumberjacks could hang their coats without them freezing to the wall overnight. Outside, the camps began to grow little amenities, bathhouses, blacksmith sheds, sometimes even tiny stores where men could buy tobacco, socks, or the occasional bar of soap. It was all charged to their company account, of course, meaning they were still perpetually in debt. But psychologically, It felt like progress. A man could at least pretend to have choices, even if the company owned both the goods and his paycheck. Let's pause for a moment to consider how they spent their rare leisure time. After dinner, with the stove roaring and snow falling outside, the bunkhouse would transform into a world of chatter and low laughter. Some men whittled, shaping miniature axes or little figures out of scrap wood. Others mended socks, smoked, or played endless games of cribbage. The atmosphere was one of rough warmth, everyone too tired to argue much, bound together by shared misery and cheap tobacco. Songs were common too. Lumberjacks had their own folk tunes, slow, rhythmic, usually about trees, women, or drinking. Often all three. Some songs mourned men lost to accidents. Others celebrated legendary loggers who allegedly chopped for 7 days straight without rest. None of it was true, of course, but after 12 hours in freezing rain, no one cared. As the camps grew larger, inspectors and journalists occasionally visited. They'd report on the noble lumbermen who supplied timber for the growing cities, often romanticizing their life. To outsiders, it sounded almost poetic, rugged men conquering nature. But if you asked the loggers themselves, they'd probably just grunt and tell you nature was winning most days. By the 1920s, motorized trucks and saws began creeping into the picture, changing everything again. The camps grew smaller, more mobile, less dependent on massive bunkhouses. The golden age of communal sawdust living was fading. Some men missed it. The rough companionship, the endless jokes about frostbite. Others ran from it, happy to trade pine smoke for anything else. Still, even as modern machinery transformed the industry, the image of the lumberjack persisted. The man in plaid, the steady rhythm of axe and saw, the flickering lamplight in a bunkhouse deep in the woods. Civilization may have crept in, but the spirit of the old camps lingered like smoke that never quite cleared. And so, as we leave behind these slightly cleaner bunkhouses, tar paper and all, let's drift forward into the twilight years of the great lumber camps. The railroads were moving in, machines were humming, and the forests were shrinking. But for one last stretch, the men stayed, sleeping in creaky bunks and waking before dawn, because that's what they'd always done. Next, we'll wander into the final era of the classic lumberjack, when the world changed, but the bunkhouse smell didn't. Chapter 9. The last timber camps, when machines moved in and men moved on. By the time the 1930s rolled in, the world of the lumberjack had started to feel like a ghost story. The great forests of the north were thinning, and the echo of axes was slowly being replaced by the growl of gasoline engines. Trucks replaced sleighs, chainsaws replaced handsaws, and bunkhouses, those smoky wooden hives of snoring, storytelling, and existential scratching, were fading into the past. It wasn't an overnight transformation. At first, the old and the new coexisted in awkward harmony. You might see a steam-powered skidder dragging logs down a frozen road while a man with an axe stood by, glaring at it like it had insulted his mother. For decades, muscle and machine worked side by side. The old-timers called the new equipment lazy man's tools. The young guys just called it efficient. Efficiency, though, came with a price. The big logging companies realized they could do the same work with fewer men. Camps that once held 100 lumberjacks now needed 20. The once bustling bunkhouses grew quieter. A few men left for cities, others for new logging territories farther north or west. A handful just stayed until the trees ran out, like caretakers of an ending world. The newer camps, built in the machine age, were cleaner, technically. The bunkhouses had stoves with actual chimneys that worked, and sometimes even insulation made from real materials instead of damp moss. The bunks were metal-framed, uniform, cold but practical. Gone were the carved initials, the wooden walls darkened by decades of smoke, the sense that this was home, even if a miserable one. The modern bunkhouse looked sterile, and to the old loggers that felt wrong. Many of them missed the noise, the arguments, the thick smell of tobacco and wet wool. Machines didn't tell stories around the stove. They didn't sing off-key or share their last biscuit. They just hummed, clanked, and got the job done faster than any man could. And while that was progress, it was also the quiet death of an entire way of life. Let's picture one of those late-era bunkhouses. It's the mid-1940s. The world's at war again, though deep in the forests of Canada and the northern US, life goes on much the same. The camp sits in a valley, surrounded by the ghosts of stumps where trees once stood. Inside, maybe 20 men gather around an oil stove. They wear machine grease instead of sap now, and the sound of diesel engines hums from the distance. Their bunks are lined in military precision, 2 rows, each man with a metal footlocker. There's a radio in the corner, playing faint music through the static. A few men listen, others play cards, and one old logger sits quietly sharpening a small axe that he no longer needs. It's habit. Ritual. The sound of the file on metal is steady and comforting. The cookhouse has changed too. Gone is the burly, temperamental cook with a shotgun over the door. In his place is a hired hand with canned vegetables, processed meat, and electric stoves. Meals are predictable and therefore boring. The old cook might have been a tyrant, but at least the food had character. Now it tastes like bureaucracy. The lumber companies had become corporate giants by this point. They owned railroads, mills, even towns. The days of independent logging crews were over. Everything was organized, timed, and recorded. Men punched clocks instead of chopping until they couldn't feel their hands. And yet, for all that modernization, something very human persisted in those final bunkhouses, a sense of shared endurance. When night came, the talk was different from the old days. The older men told stories of the past, about the blizzards that buried camps, the fights that broke out over burnt coffee, the time someone tried to ride a log downriver and lived to brag about it. The younger men listened, half amused, half disbelieving. To them, the idea of sleeping in a lice-infested log hut sounded like myth. They couldn't imagine it. And maybe that was for the best. Outside, the forests were changing too. Roads cut deeper into what had once been remote wilderness. Trucks carried timber faster than any sled team could. The logging season no longer depended entirely on winter. And so, the old rhythms vanished. No more waiting for freeze-up. No more bunkhouses buried in snowdrifts. Camps became temporary, mobile, made of prefabricated buildings that could be hauled in and out within weeks. For many of the last true lumberjacks, this new world felt hollow. They missed the sense of permanence, even if that permanence was made of splinters and smoke. There was a kind of honor in surviving those harsh winters together, in making a home out of the impossible. Now, everything felt too easy, too fast. And yet, there's a quiet beauty in that ending. History has a way of softening the edges. When people look back now, they see romance in the life of the lumberjack, the songs, the strength, the freedom of the forest. They forget the back pain, the frostbite, the smell. What remains is the myth, the man in red plaid, swinging his axe beneath towering pines, sleeping in a bunkhouse that crackled with laughter and wood smoke. That myth lingers in culture, in old folk songs, postcards, and tourist traps selling flannel. It's neat and nostalgic, but somewhere behind that image lies the truth. The bunkhouses were rough, the lives were short, and the men who built them rarely had time to notice they were building history. By the 1950s, most of those original bunkhouses were gone, either collapsed into the ground or dismantled for lumber one last time. A few still stand today, deep in forgotten corners of forest preserves, their logs dark with rot, their roofs sagging under decades of moss. Inside, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of boots on creaking boards, the murmur of tired voices, and the soft hiss of a wood stove burning its last ember. So, that's where the story of the lumberjack bunkhouse ends, in quiet decay, surrounded by the very woods it once helped destroy. It's fitting in a poetic sort of way. The men who lived there didn't think of themselves as part of some grand saga. They just wanted warmth, a dry bunk, and maybe a decent cup of coffee. But in chasing those small comforts, they left behind a legend of endurance and grit that still smells faintly of pine smoke. Let's drift one last time into the twilight of those wooden camps, where the forest reclaimed what was once taken, and where the ghosts of lumberjacks still sleep, snoring softly beneath a roof of snow. Chapter 10: Ghosts in the Timber, What the Bunkhouses Left Behind. By the time the last bunkhouses fell silent, the forest had started whispering again. The saws were gone, the shouting had stopped, and only the wind moved through the ruins. What had once been a living, creaking organism of men, laughter, and smoke had become a skeleton, moss-covered logs, rusted stoves, and the occasional coffee tin half buried in the dirt. And, in a way, that's the perfect metaphor for the lumberjack world itself. Used up, left behind, and slowly folded back into the forest it carved. But ghosts have a way of lingering. Not the spooky kind, just the quiet, human kind. You can feel them if you visit an old campsite in winter, when the snow settles like a blanket and the silence feels heavier than it should. The air still carries that faint resin scent, the same one that clung to every coat and beard a century ago. Somewhere under the soil, there's probably an old horseshoe or a bent nail from a bunk bed that once held a man too tired to dream. Local historians and hobbyists still find remnants of those camps. A broken axe head, a tin plate, sometimes even the stone foundation of a cookhouse. The artifacts are small, unremarkable to most, but to anyone who's read the old records or listened to the few surviving stories, they're like fossils of labor. Each one whispers something mundane yet powerful. We were here. The memory of bunkhouse life also survives in stories passed down, usually through families of loggers. Grandfathers would talk about how their fathers cut with the hard way, and every telling made it sound a little more heroic, a little less miserable. By the time it reached the grandchildren, the lice and frostbite were gone, replaced by tall tales of strength and camaraderie. That's how legends are born, not from what really happened, but from what we'd rather remember. Some of those old camps have been reconstructed for museums or heritage parks. You can visit them, walk through replica bunkhouses that smell faintly of new wood and nostalgia. The beds are neatly made, the stoves are clean, and interpretive signs tell you about the hard but noble life of the lumberjack. It's sweet, but also a little funny. Real lumberjacks would probably roll their eyes at the tidy display. They'd point out that no real bunkhouse ever looked that clean. Not for more than 15 minutes, anyway. Still, these places serve a purpose. They remind us that civilization didn't just spring from cities and politics. It was hacked out of frozen forests by men who lived and died in places no one thought worth visiting. They remind us that the warmth we take for granted, the walls around us, the floors under our feet, was once earned by people who slept inches from the cold ground and woke before dawn to swing an axe until their hands bled. And if you read the old journals, a few survive. Surprisingly, you catch glimpses of how they thought about their own lives. There's almost no poetry in their words, no grand reflections. Just simple observations. Snowed again today. Cook burned the beans. Bill cut his hand bad, says he's fine. It's the kind of plain honesty that says more than flowery memoirs ever could. These were not men who romanticized themselves. They worked, they slept, and they hoped their pay didn't vanish in company deductions. The communities that grew around logging, the small towns that supplied the camps, changed too. When the big trees were gone, so were the jobs. Some towns became ghost towns almost overnight. Others reinvented themselves, tourism, paper mills, or small manufacturing. But even in those that survived, the culture of the old camps left its mark. You can still find it in regional accents, in the stubborn work ethic, in the way some locals tell stories that begin with "back in the camp days" and end with something that sounds half like myth. There's also a strange tenderness in the way people talk about those times now. For all the hardship, the danger, and the dirt, there's a sense of pride that seeps through. Maybe it's because the bunkhouses represented something we've mostly lost, a kind of brutal simplicity. Life boiled down to the basics: food, warmth, work, and the company of others in the same miserable situation. There was no distraction, no endless noise. Just survival, and the strange comfort of shared exhaustion. The forests have changed, of course. Many of the areas once stripped bare by loggers have regrown. Some are now protected, silent, and green again, as if nothing ever happened. But under those tall second-growth pines, the earth still hides the bones of the old camps. Not human ones, but wooden, iron, and ash. Every so often, a hiker or hunter stumbles upon a square outline of rotted logs, or a chunk of rusted stovepipe, and wonders what it was. And just like that, the bunkhouse lives again for a moment. If there's a moral to this long, sleepy tale, It's probably that history is rarely tidy. The lumberjack bunkhouse wasn't a symbol of progress or tragedy, it was just what had to be built to survive a specific kind of work in a specific kind of place. It was ugly, cold, loud, and somehow human. It was both the worst and best thing about frontier life. A mess that somehow held people together. When you think about it, the story of the bunkhouse is really the story of adaptation. Men took what they had, wood, fire, each other, and made it work. Not perfectly, but enough. And when that way of life ended, the world didn't collapse. It just moved on. Machines took over, the forests healed, and the old camps dissolved quietly into memory. But the endurance, that quiet strength, it's still there in the way we build, the way we work, the way we tell stories about how things used to be. So, if you ever find yourself deep in a northern forest, late in the evening, when the air smells of pine and the ground crunches with frost, take a moment. Listen. The wind moving through the trees? It might just sound like what it always did, the long sigh of a world built on wood and willpower. And maybe, just maybe in the distance, you'll hear it, a faint echo of laughter from a bunkhouse long gone. The sound of men settling in after a day's work, tired but content as the stove pops, the coffee simmers, and the snow begins to fall outside. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, just life, rough, quiet, and endlessly human. Let's fade there, into the stillness, the smoke, and the soft memory of a bunkhouse that once kept the cold at bay. Chapter 11, Legends Carved in Wood, How the Lumberjack Lives On. Even though the last real bunkhouses have long since collapsed, and the machines now hum where axes once rang, the spirit of the lumberjack refuses to vanish entirely. It lingers in stories, in culture, and even in the occasional tourist trap selling flannel and mugs that say, "I survived the woods." It's an endurance story, told quietly without fanfare, but persistent, like the scent of pine that refuses to leave the back of your coat. Folklore, of course, played a major role. By the mid-20th century, Paul Bunyan was everywhere. Murals, books, postcards, even commercials. He was exaggerated, absurd, clean, and completely unlike the men who actually slept in sawdust-filled bunks. But the underlying truth of the legend was simple. It represented human endurance, humor, and the stubbornness to survive harsh conditions. Bunyan might have been a giant, but the real lumberjacks were giant in their own quiet, ordinary way. Local festivals started to appear, celebrating the history of logging. Lumberjack competitions, with chainsaws and log rolling, became spectacles. They were part athletic contest, part tourist attraction, and part homage. The competitions weren't about survival anymore. They were about skill, tradition, and nostalgia. People cheered for men and women who could split logs in seconds, toss axes precisely, and balance on floating timbers, unaware that 100 years earlier, those same skills were necessary just to stay alive. Museums also preserved artifacts, axes, boots, cookhouse utensils, journals, and bunkhouse remnants. Each object tells a small story, the wear of decades, the scratches from careless hands, the smell faintly of resin and sweat. Standing in a display case, they look neat, tidy, and almost quaint. In reality, they were tools of exhaustion, survival, and monotony. They were instruments that shaped lives, communities, and landscapes. The bunkhouse itself, as an architectural form, remains iconic. Its shape, rectangular, rough-hewn, with a central stove and rows of bunks, has become shorthand for frontier life in films, books, and documentaries. And while no one lives in one quite like they did a century ago, the form survives in camp cabins, scout lodges, and even summer retreats. The design is simple, practical, and enduring, a reminder that function, however uncomfortable, can persist far beyond its original users. Interestingly, the cultural memory of the lumberjack is almost universally positive. Tales emphasize courage, camaraderie, and humor rather than frostbite, lice, and early deaths. The harshness of the work, the discomfort of the bunkhouse, the fear of being crushed by falling timber, all of that fades in the retelling. What remains is the idea of rugged individuals, men and women who faced the forest and, in some small way, conquered it. But the reality, as always, was quieter. Lumberjacks were not epic heroes. They were ordinary men and women forced into extraordinary circumstances. They survived by routine, by solidarity, and by making small comforts wherever possible. A patch on a sock, a hot meal, a bunk that didn't collapse overnight. Their lives were largely unrecorded, except for the occasional journal, letter, or official record. Yet the repetition, the monotony, and the shared endurance left a mark that no machine, no forest regrowth, could erase. Even in modern logging operations, echoes of the old bunkhouse persist. Crews still live together in temporary housing when working remote sites. They still share meals, tell stories, and rely on each other's skills. The difference is that the danger is less visceral, the tools mechanized, and the work regulated. Still, the core principle remains. Humans are social creatures, and hardship is always softened by shared experience. Education and tourism continue to reinforce the legend. In northern US and Canadian communities, school children learn about logging history as part of their curriculum. They hear about Paul Bunyan, sure, but they also learn about real men who labored in deep snow, fought mosquitoes the size of small birds, and slept in poorly ventilated cabins. The curriculum is gentle, not meant to terrify, but it preserves the memory of endurance. The bunkhouse, in particular, has become a symbol of that endurance. It represents something very human, the ability to adapt to harsh conditions, the capacity to share discomfort without complaint, and the small triumphs of daily life. A clean bed, a hot meal, a story told by the fire, these are victories as significant as any timber haul or record-breaking axe swing. As logging machinery became dominant, the physical bunkhouse became less essential. But culturally, it lives on, in photographs, novels, folk songs, and even documentaries. It is often romanticized, yes, but always with a nod to reality. Work was exhausting, life was harsh, and men and women endured together. There is a beauty in that endurance that transcends glamour, danger, or nostalgia. The forests themselves, slowly regrowing in many areas, serve as silent memorials. Each sapling that rises where a great tree once fell is a quiet echo of labor and survival. Nature and culture intertwine here. The land remembers the humans who shaped it, and humans remember the bunkhouses, stoves, and sawdust-filled floors where they survived. By the late 20th century, few people who worked in the original style of logging remained. Their children moved on to cities, new trades, or mechanized forestry. And yet, the bunkhouse endures as a symbol, a story, and a memory. It's a small, stubborn testament to human resilience, to men and women who lived without modern comfort, survived on routine and companionship, and carved both timber and legend out of the wilderness. In this quiet way, the bunkhouse tells a much larger story, about human adaptation, about community in adversity, and about the gentle power of endurance. It reminds us that even the harshest circumstances can produce rituals, humor, and connection. And in the soft glow of remembered stoves and distant forests, the past lingers, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like a heartbeat beneath the pines. And so, the lumberjack lives on. Not just in Paul Bunyan or in museum displays, not just in folklore or photographs, but in the quiet memory of what it meant to survive, together, in smoke, splinters, and snow. The bunkhouse, in all its rough glory, becomes less a building and more a vessel of human experience, a place where ordinary people endured extraordinary winters. Next, we'll drift into the final reflections on the legacy of these camps, the myth versus reality, and why, even today, the image of the lumberjack continues to capture our imagination. Chapter 12. Reflections in the Pines, the Legacy of the Lumberjack and the Bunkhouse. As we drift toward the final chapter of this long, quiet exploration, it's worth pausing to consider what the bunkhouses really left behind. Not just the logs, the sawdust, or the rusted stoves, but the intangible threads, resilience, humor, camaraderie, and memory that continue to echo through forests, museums, stories, and even our imagination. The bunkhouse was more than a shelter. It was a microcosm of survival, a small world built out of necessity. Within its walls, men shared warmth, food, and quiet conversation. They suffered together, laughed together, and occasionally cursed at each other or the company cook. It was a world stripped down to essentials: sleep, labor, nourishment, and companionship. And in that stripped-down life, they found ways to survive, not only physically, but emotionally. Even the hardships, frostbite, lice, cold floors, the endless sound of snoring, became part of the identity. They were badges of endurance, proof that a man could endure discomfort and still return to the forest the next day. Every splintered floorboard, every creaking bunk, every blackened stove was part of the tapestry of existence in the logging world. The bunkhouse shaped not only bodies but communities, forging bonds that were often stronger than those in towns, cities, or even families. The transition from hand logging to mechanized logging didn't erase the culture. Instead, it transformed it. Legends like Paul Bunyan emerged, songs were written, and artifacts were preserved, but underlying all the romanticism was the simple fact that real people had endured, survived, and, in small ways, thrived. They worked in the cold, ate what they could, and slept wherever possible, often next to men who had become more family than fellow workers. Cultural memory has a way of smoothing rough edges. The romance of the lumberjack life now dominates how we think about it. We imagine red plaid shirts, perfect axes, heroic feats, and enduring strength. In truth, the life was monotonous, dirty, exhausting, and sometimes fatal. But perhaps that is precisely why the myth endures. The contrast between reality and legend makes the story compelling, comforting, and human. It allows us to admire courage without dwelling too much on suffering. And yet, for those who research, explore, or visit the remnants of camps, the reality is never fully lost. Walking through a decayed bunkhouse, standing beside an old stove, or brushing snow off a collapsed roof offers a tactile connection to the past. It's a reminder that history is lived, not just written. That survival is messy, uncomfortable, and profoundly human. The bunkhouse also reminds us of adaptation, of people using ingenuity and cooperation to survive extremes. The way men shared resources, solved problems, and made small comforts in harsh environments is a story worth remembering, because it reflects an essential human skill, the ability to endure and create meaning even in discomfort. In literature, film, and folklore, the lumberjack is often portrayed as a solitary figure, standing tall against the wilderness. The bunkhouse narrative complicates that image, revealing a collective experience, humans in community, relying on one another to withstand cold, isolation, and exhaustion. It's a quieter heroism, less visible than a single strong man, but no less remarkable. We can also see the legacy in modern outdoor culture. Camping, scouting, winter expeditions, and even remote work sites echo the same rhythms. Shared spaces, simple meals, long hours, and the camaraderie that forms when survival demands cooperation. The bunkhouse model, stripped of its discomfort, continues to shape how people experience challenging environments today. Finally, there is a philosophical lesson in all of this. Life in the bunkhouse was about accepting reality, harsh, cold, and imperfect, and finding joy and purpose in small, repeatable actions. A meal shared, a story told, a bed made as best as possible. It reminds us that human resilience is not always flashy or heroic. Sometimes it's quiet, repetitive, and patient. And sometimes that is enough. As we settle into this reflection, it's worth imagining the quiet echo of those bunkhouses one last time. The faint creak of wood, the soft murmur of voices, the distant pop of a stove, and the smell of pine lingering in the air. It is a memory suspended in time, a whisper of endurance, and a testament to what humans can endure together. The bunkhouse may be gone, the lumberjacks may have moved on, and the forests may have regrown. But the legacy endures. Not in grandeur or spectacle, but in quiet remembrance, in stories, in cultural echoes, and in the simple, timeless human need to endure, adapt, and find connection, even in the coldest, loneliest places. And so, the final image lingers. A dimly lit bunkhouse, smoke curling from a stove, men sitting quietly, sharing warmth, stories, and survival. A place of human endurance carved out of wood, snow, and determination. That, perhaps, is the truest monument left behind by the Lumberjacks and their bunkhouses. Chapter 13: Folklore, Tourism, and the Modern Myth of the Lumberjack. With the physical bunkhouses fading into history, the story of the lumberjack transformed from lived experience into legend. And as often happens, legend is sweeter, cleaner, and slightly taller than reality. While the actual camps were cold, smoky, and full of sawdust, folklore polished the rough edges, turning exhausted men into towering heroes and frostbitten fingers into feats of impossible strength. The most famous figure, of course, is Paul Bunyan. He is everywhere, on murals, in books, in commercials, and even on roadside attractions with statues taller than a house. He's clean, cartoonish, and absurdly heroic. And while he's nothing like the men who huddled in cold bunkhouses, he represents something real, the awe-inspiring scale of the work and the endurance required to live it. His blue ox, Babe, might be mythical, but the forests he supposedly cleared were very real. Bunyan is folklore's way of acknowledging what human labor once achieved, but with a sense of humor and exaggeration that makes it digestible. Lumberjack festivals began appearing in towns across North America, particularly in the northern US and Canada. These festivals celebrate skill, strength, and tradition. Competitions include log rolling, axe throwing, and chainsaw carving, each event a spectacle that simultaneously entertains and nods to the heritage of those early loggers. The spectators clap and cheer, often unaware that a century ago, failing to roll a log or chop accurately could mean injury or death. The stakes were far higher, the fatigue far deeper, and the camaraderie far more necessary than any modern contest can replicate. Tourism also played a major role in shaping the modern perception of lumberjack life. Cabin rentals, reconstructed camps, and themed attractions allow visitors to experience logging life, usually in a sanitized, romanticized form. Beds are made, stoves are safe, and no one actually risks frostbite. The experience is immersive, sure, but it's a world carefully curated for comfort. Yet even in this form, it keeps memory alive. Visitors leave with a faint sense of the harsh reality, even if only in imagination, and they carry forward an appreciation for endurance, adaptation, and community. Books and films contributed as well. Children's literature, particularly mid-20th century publications, portrayed lumberjacks as heroic, clean, and almost whimsical figures. Movies often followed suit, favoring tall tales and adventure over monotony, exhaustion, or lice. Yet, somewhere between the pages and the screen, echoes of the real lumberjack life persist. The long hours, the reliance on others, the rhythm of work and rest, and the simple human pleasures of warmth and shared meals. Even in popular music, the rhythm of logging work, chopping, hauling, rolling logs, inspired songs. Work songs kept spirits up during long, monotonous days. They created a cadence that helped maintain endurance and fostered solidarity. While modern listeners might find them quaint or melodic, for the men themselves, these songs were functional, a tool for survival, a shared beat that made exhausting labor slightly more bearable. The bunkhouse, meanwhile, became the central symbol in all these representations. It is immediately recognizable, rectangular, wooden, lined with bunks, with a stove in the center. Even when recreated for tourists or film sets, it carries the weight of history, the smell of wood smoke, the warmth of shared space, and the subtle tension of men packed together in discomfort. It embodies both the hardship and the camaraderie that defined the logging life. Historians have worked to preserve authenticity alongside folklore. They highlight letters, journals, and photographs from real camps to remind us that behind the myth were men who endured frost, fatigue, and injury. These records often describe the mundane, breakfast, repairs, chores, and the quiet frustrations of daily survival. The contrast between reality and legend is stark, yet both coexist, enriching the story of the lumberjack for future generations. Today, the lumberjack is a cultural icon, a figure representing strength, endurance, and rugged individualism. Yet, underlying the image is a deeper truth, the power of human adaptation and the importance of community. The modern myth glosses over discomfort and danger, but it preserves the spirit. The bunkhouse, the stove, the shared meal, these were the true foundations of the endurance the legend celebrates. In this way, the bunkhouse continues to live, not only in reconstructed buildings or festivals, but in the imagination. It teaches lessons about resilience, cooperation, and finding small comforts amid hardship. The modern perception may be cleaner and taller than reality, but it keeps the memory alive, ensuring that the quiet courage of countless men is never completely forgotten. And so, the story of the bunkhouse moves from history into folklore, from fact into legend. The buildings may rot, the stoves may rust, and the forests may regrow, but the endurance, humor, and quiet humanity that defined the lumberjack experience remain vivid. They endure in our songs, our stories, and our imagination, a testament to the people who once lived and labored in smoke, splinters, and cold. Chapter 14. Personal Stories and Diaries. Listening to the voices of the lumberjacks. To truly understand the life of a lumberjack, it helps to step away from broad history and look closely at the people themselves. Diaries, letters, and memoirs provide a rare window into daily existence, a life dominated by cold, labor, and bunkhouse camaraderie. They are often mundane, occasionally humorous, and always revealing of human endurance. Take, for example, a diary kept by Thomas Whitaker, a logger in northern Minnesota around 1905. His entries are short, almost clipped, yet vivid. Woke frozen. Stove not lit. Coffee lukewarm. Snow up to knee. Axe dull. Feet wet. Survived. That's it for a day's work. No epic drama, no heroic speeches, just survival. And yet, in that simplicity, you can feel the rhythm of life, the repeated struggle, and the tiny victories that punctuated each day. A bed warmed by a stove, a meal that didn't burn, a hand steady enough to fell a tree safely, these were triumphs. Letters home often reveal humor in the bleakest conditions. One lumberjack wrote to his sister, "Bill lost his hat in the river again. He cried. We laughed. Coffee saved the day." Humor was a lifeline, a way to preserve sanity while enduring discomfort, frostbite, and exhaustion. The bunkhouse amplified these small human moments. Laughter echoed in rows of bunks, disputes flared over coffee or stolen socks, and companionship softened the hardship. Another diary, from a logger in Quebec around 1912, provides insight into relationships in the bunkhouse. He described the nightly routines with surprising intimacy, sharing blankets, trading mittens, covering each other when frostbite threatened. There was teasing, bickering, and occasional fights, but also remarkable care. These men depended on one another for survival, and the bunkhouse fostered a form of rough, practical intimacy that outsiders rarely experienced. Some stories reveal resilience in the face of tragedy. When a sled overturned or a tree fell the wrong way, men often responded with calm efficiency. Injuries were treated as part of life, not catastrophes, but setbacks to overcome. One entry notes, Tom's hand cut, bandaged, back to work, coffee first. Life did not pause for pain. Survival demanded routine, pragmatism, and the acceptance of discomfort as normal. Humor was also a social glue. Pranks were common, ranging from harmless mischief, stealing someone's hat or hiding their boots, to elaborate jokes designed to break the monotony of long winter nights. One story describes a group convincing a newcomer that a wolf had learned to mimic human voices. The rookie spent hours listening for phantom howls, much to everyone else's amusement. The bunkhouse, in all its crowded, noisy glory, became a stage for camaraderie, endurance, and subtle competition. Personal journals also illuminate the rhythms of work and leisure. Early mornings, sometimes before dawn, were for chopping, hauling, or clearing paths. Meals were brief but hearty. Evenings involved repairs, card games, or storytelling. Many men noted the small moments that made life bearable. A clear night sky visible from a frosted window, the warmth of a shared blanket, or a simple conversation with a bunkmate. These were the small joys that allowed endurance to persist amid hardship. Women appear occasionally in the diaries, usually in town visits or letters from home. Their presence is gentle, often symbolizing warmth, domesticity, and stability, a sharp contrast to the cold, harsh environment of the forest. Some logs even mention brief romances or flirtations during trips to nearby towns. While fleeting, these moments offered emotional reprieve and a reminder of life beyond the sawdust and snow. Older loggers often reflected on their experiences with a mixture of nostalgia and practicality. One man wrote, "It was cold, it was hard, and I'd never wish it on anyone, but I learned to work, to laugh, to survive." There's a humility in these reflections, a recognition that life in the bunkhouse was neither glamorous nor heroic, yet profoundly formative. It shaped character, endurance, and a quiet understanding of human interdependence. Even mundane details carry significance. How a man patched his coat, sharpened his axe, or stacked firewood speaks volumes about the importance of preparation, skill, and foresight. These small acts were daily strategies for survival. The bunkhouse was a place where practical knowledge was shared, where experience mattered more than rank or ego. Reading these diaries, letters, and memoirs, one notices a striking pattern: the focus on community. Individuals mattered, but survival depended on cooperation. Sharing warmth, tending to a burned stove, swapping tools, and supporting one another during accidents were all part of bunkhouse life. The buildings themselves were more than shelter, they were facilitators of human endurance. Ultimately, these personal accounts remind us that history is built on ordinary lives. The bunkhouse may be gone, the forests may have regrown, and machinery may dominate, but the lived experience of those men, their struggles, humor, and quiet resilience, remains preserved in their words. In these pages, we see the human side of the lumberjack story, the men who endured frostbite, fatigue, and monotony, who laughed when they could have cursed, who cared for one another despite the cold, and who found meaning in small routines. The bunkhouse emerges not as a relic, but as a vessel for human perseverance, a stage where survival, humor, and camaraderie played out day after day. Chapter 15: The Bunkhouse in Modern Memory, Museums, Media, and Cultural Resonance. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the physical bunkhouses of the logging era were almost entirely gone. Yet, the memory of these rough-hewn, smoke-filled shelters persists, preserved not in wood and nails, but in museums, media, and cultural storytelling. The bunkhouse has become more than a place to sleep. It's a symbol of resilience, community, and human adaptation. Museums have been at the forefront of preserving this memory. In northern U.S. states and Canada, historical societies reconstructed bunkhouses, cookhouses, and logging camps to demonstrate daily life to visitors. Walk into one of these replicas, and you see rows of bunks, iron stoves, and tools arranged as they might have been over a century ago. Labels and interpretive panels explain routines, how men chopped wood, heated water, prepared meals, and endured the harsh winter months. Visitors are often surprised at the cramped quarters, the simple furnishings, and the shared spaces. Life was not luxurious, but it worked. Artifacts in these museums carry stories of ordinary endurance. Axes nicked and worn from decades of use, tin plates blackened by fire, journals with clipped handwriting, each item evokes a life of labor and adaptation. Photographs of men in thick flannel, standing in deep snow beside their bunkhouses, show resilience in every stance. Visitors may romanticize it, but the evidence of struggle and ingenuity is undeniable. Media has played a similar role. Documentaries, books, and even television series have highlighted the bunkhouse as a focal point of lumberjack life. Authors often emphasize both the hardship and the humor of the men who lived there. Even fictionalized accounts retain kernels of truth: the crowded bunks, the stove-centered social life, the camaraderie, and the small victories that made survival bearable. The bunkhouse is portrayed not as a backdrop, but as a character in its own right, a silent witness to exhaustion, resilience, and laughter. Cultural events have further cemented the bunkhouse's place in public imagination. Lumberjack festivals, competitions, and heritage days often include reconstructed cabins, staged bunkhouses, or even temporary shelters that allow visitors to experience, in a limited and sanitized way, the routines of historical logging life. Children and adults alike can roll logs, chop wood, or simulate chores, gaining appreciation for the physical demands endured by the men who lived in real bunkhouses. The bunkhouse also features prominently in folklore and storytelling. Songs, poems, and oral histories recount life in the camp with a mixture of nostalgia and exaggeration. Tales emphasize humor, resourcefulness, and camaraderie, often glossing over the discomfort, danger, and monotony. The result is a collective memory that balances reality and legend, preserving both the hardship and the spirit of the men who once inhabited these structures. Even popular culture adopts this image. The stereotypical lumberjack, plaid shirt, suspenders, strong arms, and a stoic expression, is rarely seen without a backdrop reminiscent of a bunkhouse. The stove, the smoke, and the stacked bunks are evoked, implicitly or explicitly, in films, advertising, and artwork. These representations are idealized, but they draw on historical truth, emphasizing endurance, teamwork, and ruggedness. Educational programs continue to use bunkhouse history to illustrate broader themes: survival in harsh climates, human adaptation to extreme environments, and the development of early North American industry. Students learn not just about timber, tools, or trade, but about the lived experience of people who shaped landscapes while enduring privation. Bunkhouses provide a tangible lens through which to understand the daily realities of laborers and the social structures that supported them. In many ways, the bunkhouse has become a metaphor. It represents more than shelter. It embodies human perseverance, improvisation, and social cohesion. The cramped quarters, the shared heat, the small acts of kindness or humor all highlight that even in the harshest conditions, people find ways to survive together. Museums and media preserve not just objects or architecture, but the lessons inherent in those spaces. The legacy is also personal. Descendants of loggers often preserve stories, tools, and letters, passing them down alongside family history. They keep alive a sense of identity, grounded in endurance, labor, and shared struggle. The bunkhouse, in these narratives, becomes a symbol of ancestry, resilience, and cultural continuity. And yet, the story is dynamic. As society changes, interpretations of bunkhouse life shift. Some emphasize hardship and danger, some humor and camaraderie, others the industrial and environmental impact of logging. Together, these perspectives create a layered understanding. The bunkhouse is simultaneously a historical artifact, a cultural symbol, and a vessel of memory. So, when we think about the bunkhouse today, we're thinking about more than boards and nails. We're thinking about human resilience, the formation of community in adversity, the rhythms of shared labor, and the ingenuity required to endure life on the frontier of forest and frost. Through museums, media, festivals, and family stories, the bunkhouse continues to resonate, not as a relic of the past, but as a living symbol of adaptation, endurance, and quiet human courage. Chapter 16. Lessons from the Bunkhouse: Endurance, Community, and Human Ingenuity. As we draw the story of the Lumberjack bunkhouse toward reflection, it's worth asking what lessons these simple, rough structures leave behind. Beyond logs and stoves, beyond snow, frostbite, and toil, the bunkhouse teaches us about endurance, community, and human ingenuity. It's a quiet, patient wisdom, one learned in inches rather than grand gestures, and it resonates far beyond the frozen forests of North America. First, there's endurance. Life in a bunkhouse demanded daily resilience. Men faced cold, exhaustion, blisters, and the ever-present risk of injury. Their work required strength, patience, and consistency. Survival was not about single heroic feats, but about showing up day after day and performing the same grueling tasks while maintaining enough energy to eat, sleep, and care for fellow men. The lesson is simple. Endurance is often quiet, cumulative, and measured in repetition rather than spectacle. Next, there's community. Bunkhouses were crowded, noisy, and often uncomfortable. Privacy was scarce, tempers flared, and personal space was minimal. Yet, these conditions fostered interdependence. Men shared warmth, meals, and stories. They cared for one another in practical ways, mending clothes, tending injuries, or keeping the stove lit. The bunkhouse demonstrates that hardship can forge bonds, and that collective survival often requires cooperation, trust, and humor. Even in discomfort, humans find ways to support one another. Ingenuity also thrives in adversity. The bunkhouse was never luxurious. Loggers improvised repairs, constructed shelving, rigged stoves, and even carved simple decorations into walls to pass the time or leave their mark. They adapted to changing conditions, from shifting weather to damaged equipment, using whatever materials were at hand. It's a reminder that human creativity is often at its sharpest when resources are limited, and that necessity is a potent teacher. There's also a subtle lesson in perspective. Diaries and letters reveal that lumberjacks measured success differently than modern society often does. A warm bunk, a full meal, and a day survived without serious injury were victories. These measures contrast sharply with contemporary markers of achievement like wealth, status, or fame. The bunkhouse, in its simplicity, reorients us to appreciate small, practical triumphs, daily victories that sustain life, rather than grand gestures that impress others. Humor, too, emerges as a critical survival tool. Life in the bunkhouse was monotonous and harsh, yet laughter, pranks, and storytelling provided psychological relief. Humor served as a social lubricant, a way to endure, and a subtle act of defiance against discomfort and monotony. It teaches a gentle but enduring truth. Perspective, levity, and shared amusement can soften even the most difficult circumstances. There's also the lesson of adaptability over time. Early bunkhouses were moss-lined, smoky, and improvised. Later, they became more structured, reflecting industrialization, mechanization, and evolving safety standards. The culture adapted alongside technology, demonstrating the human capacity to adjust to changing environments while maintaining social cohesion and shared purpose. Endurance, community, and ingenuity persisted, even as the structures themselves evolved. Finally, the bunkhouse offers a reflection on memory and legacy. Though the buildings have mostly vanished, their stories endure in museums, folklore, festivals, and family histories. They remind us that ordinary lives can leave extraordinary impressions, and that resilience, cooperation, and creativity are values worth remembering. It's not the splendor of architecture or the scale of labor alone, but the human experience within that gives the bunkhouse its lasting significance. In modern life, these lessons remain relevant. Communities rely on shared effort and mutual support. Endurance is measured in the persistence to keep showing up, in the quiet work of everyday survival. Ingenuity remains essential when resources are scarce or circumstances unpredictable. And humor, perspective, and small daily victories continue to sustain human spirit. The bunkhouse, though long gone, models these values in an enduring, if understated, way. So, when we think of a bunkhouse today, let's remember it as more than a building. It was a classroom of life lessons, carved in wood and forged in frost. It's a symbol of human perseverance, of adaptation, and of the subtle power of community. And in its silence, in the faint echo of boots on wooden floors, the bunkhouse continues to teach, offering a soft, patient reminder of what humans can endure, create, and share, even in the coldest, quietest corners of the world. Chapter 17. The End of an Era, From Bunkhouses to Modern Logging Camps. By the mid-20th century, the era of the classic wooden bunkhouse was drawing to a close. The forests were still vast, the work still grueling, but technology, transportation, and industrialization were transforming the way loggers lived and labored. The transition from rustic, shared wooden cabins to mechanized, temporary camps marked both an end and a new beginning. Modern logging camps were no longer built for permanence. Instead of constructing long-term wooden bunkhouses with hand-hewn logs, companies established portable housing that could be moved as work progressed deeper into the forest. Aluminum trailers, prefabricated cabins, and later, modular units became the standard. These structures were cleaner, safer, and more insulated from the elements. Stoves were replaced with central heating, and bunks were replaced with standard beds and sometimes even mattresses. The days of curling up in frost-filled corners were over. But along with comfort came a cultural shift. The intimacy of the bunkhouse, The shared meals, whispered stories, and close quarters that fostered camaraderie changed. Modern camps emphasized efficiency and safety over social bonding. Privacy increased, and interactions became more structured. The rowdy, smoky, communal evenings were replaced with quiet downtime in individual units or trailers. Meals might still be communal, but the sense of survival-driven cooperation was softened by convenience and mechanization. Technology also transformed the work itself. Chainsaws replaced axes, trucks replaced horse-drawn sleds, and mechanized skidders and loaders moved logs with speed and precision unimaginable a century earlier. The physical exertion remained significant, but the risk of exhaustion or frostbite declined, altering the rhythm of daily life. Whereas old bunkhouse logs record men waking before dawn to chop, haul, and cook, modern camps follow a schedule more akin to industrial workplaces: designated shifts, safety protocols, and regular breaks. Yet, despite these changes, some continuity persisted. Community, though less intense, remained important. Temporary camps fostered teamwork around machine operation, safety, and logistics. Shared hardships, breakdowns, storms, mechanical failures continued to build bonds, albeit in a different form. The bunkhouse ethos of collective endurance evolved into a culture of structured cooperation. Modern camps also incorporated new amenities. Electricity, running water, and showers became standard, dramatically improving health and comfort. Recreational spaces, gyms, and entertainment options were added to combat monotony. Whereas a bunkhouse evening might involve playing cards under the dim glow of a stove or telling stories to stave off boredom, modern loggers could watch television, read, or play games in relative warmth and comfort. The hardships were mitigated, but so was the rugged intimacy that characterized early bunkhouse life. Interestingly, the bunkhouse legacy persisted in symbolic ways. Even in modern camps, the bunkhouse culture is invoked to describe teamwork, endurance, and the shared experience of labor in isolated environments. The term remains a shorthand for rugged camaraderie, even when actual wooden bunks are absent. It reflects the enduring admiration for the way loggers adapted to extreme conditions and relied on one another to survive. The transition also had environmental implications. Mobile camps allowed forestry companies to move operations without building permanent structures, reducing the long-term footprint on the land. Combined with reforestation efforts, selective cutting, and mechanized logging, the approach marked a significant shift from the era when entire swaths of forest were stripped and replaced with bunkhouses and infrastructure. However, this evolution came at a cultural cost. The stories, songs, and rituals that grew out of bunkhouse life became less vivid. Humor and informal social practices, practical tools for endurance, had less room to develop in regulated, modernized environments. The everyday details of survival, camaraderie, and ingenuity became part of folklore, preserved in memoirs, museums, and festivals rather than lived experience. The bunkhouse, in other words, survived mostly in memory. Its influence continues in education, storytelling, and cultural events, while the reality of modern logging life reflects safety, technology, and comfort. Both eras illustrate human adaptation, one through sheer endurance and improvisation, the other through efficiency and mechanization, but the charm, messiness, and intimacy of the original bunkhouse remain unique. Ultimately, the end of the bunkhouse era reminds us that human experience is always shaped by technology, environment, and social structures. As tools and shelters evolve, the patterns of daily life, camaraderie, and adaptation shift accordingly. Yet the bunkhouse lives on, both as a cultural symbol and as a historical lesson about resilience, resourcefulness, and the quiet heroism of ordinary laborers. Chapter 18: Preserving the Memory, Festivals, Museums, and the Bunkhouse in Popular Culture. Even though the last authentic bunkhouses have long vanished into forests and history, their legacy has not faded. In fact, the bunkhouse continues to thrive in cultural memory, museums, festivals, and popular imagination. Preservation efforts, both physical and narrative, keep the spirit alive, a reminder of human endurance, community, and ingenuity in harsh conditions. Museums play a central role. Across northern North America, historical societies have reconstructed bunkhouses, cookhouses, and logging camps. Visitors can walk inside, run their hands along rough-hewn bunks, peer into iron stoves, and imagine the daily routines of men who endured frost, sawdust, and exhaustion. Artifacts, axes nicked by decades of use, tin plates blackened by open fires, journals scribbled with clipped entries, provide a tactile connection to the past. Each object carries a story of adaptation, resourcefulness, and human resilience. Festivals also celebrate the bunkhouse legacy. Lumberjack competitions, from log rolling to axe throwing, recreate the skills essential to the work, while simultaneously highlighting camaraderie and endurance. Participants and spectators alike gain a sense of the physical demands of logging life, even if modern contests lack the mortal stakes of frostbite, fatigue, or falling timber. These events often include recreated bunkhouses, cookhouse demonstrations, and storytelling sessions, allowing audiences to immerse themselves, if only partially, in historical experience. Media and popular culture contribute to the preservation as well. Documentaries, television programs, and films depict the bunkhouse as a symbol of rugged endurance, humor, and community. Even highly fictionalized portrayals, think towering axes, exaggerated feats, or cartoonish Paul Bunyan imagery, carry echoes of the real bunkhouse ethos: hard work, shared hardship, and quiet human ingenuity. Through these portrayals, audiences learn not only about tools and timber, but about the social bonds and practical resilience that defined the logging world. Oral history projects and family narratives also help keep the memory alive. Descendants of loggers often preserve diaries, letters, and photographs, sharing them with museums, schools, and local festivals. These materials convey more than facts. They convey personality, humor, struggles, and small triumphs that otherwise would vanish. Stories of frostbitten toes, pranks in the bunkhouse, or long evenings around a dim stove offer insight into lived experience, bridging the gap between historical record and human life. Even in literature and music, the bunkhouse continues to inspire. Folk songs recount the rhythm of work and daily routines. Poems highlight camaraderie and endurance. Novels explore the tension between man and wilderness. All of these creative forms preserve the bunkhouse as both a physical and symbolic space, capturing the essence of labor, community, and adaptation. Cultural tourism plays its part too. Many northern communities offer cabin stays, heritage parks, or recreated logging sites. Visitors can experience bunkhouse life in a sanitized, safe form, sharing meals, sleeping in bunks, and learning skills once necessary for survival. These immersive experiences foster appreciation for both historical reality and the human ingenuity required to thrive in remote, harsh environments. The bunkhouse also continues to influence design. Camp cabins, scout lodges, and even recreational cabins borrow the layout, communal philosophy, and utilitarian features of historical bunkhouses. The emphasis on function, warmth, and community, rather than luxury or aesthetics, reflects lessons learned from the original structures. Even when materials and amenities are modernized, the spatial logic, shared space, central stove, and simple furnishings endures. Importantly, the bunkhouse as cultural symbol reinforces broader values: endurance, cooperation, creativity, and humor in the face of adversity. Whether in museums, festivals, films, or folklore, the bunkhouse embodies the quiet, patient heroism of ordinary humans. It teaches that survival is rarely glamorous, but it is meaningful, and that community is both practical and emotionally sustaining. Through these layers, tangible artifacts, reconstructed spaces, festivals, media, and oral histories, the bunkhouse continues to resonate. It is no longer just a building of wood and nails. It is a vessel of memory, a symbol of human endurance, and a cultural touchstone connecting past and present. In this way, the legacy of the bunkhouse remains alive, echoing in the forests, museums, and imaginations of those who wish to remember the labor, humor, and quiet resilience of the lumberjack world. Chapter 19: Human Stories Behind the Wood, Diaries, Letters, and Oral Histories. The bunkhouse, in all its smoke-filled, creaking glory, was not just a building. It was a stage for human experience, for mundane victories, small tragedies, humor, and endurance. To truly grasp the life of the lumberjack, we turn to the words they left behind: diaries, letters, and oral histories. These personal accounts allow us to hear voices from the past, unfiltered by legend, sanitized nostalgia, or folklore. Take, for example, the diary of a man named Edward Mallory, who worked in Northern Ontario in 1910. His entries are simple, almost monotone, but they carry vivid impressions. Cold morning. Stove barely lit. Coffee lukewarm. Axe dull. Feet wet. Survived. There's no drama, no embellishment, just the rhythm of survival. Yet, in these clipped notes, we glimpse endurance, the ability to persist day after day under punishing conditions without complaint. The bunkhouse, with its rows of bunks and central stove, provided a shared space for these acts of perseverance, quietly nurturing resilience. Letters to family often reveal humor as a coping mechanism. One logger wrote home, "Bill lost his hat in the river again. He cried. We laughed. Coffee saved the day." Humor was not frivolous. It was a strategy, a social glue, and a way to maintain sanity amid frost, fatigue, and isolation. The bunkhouse amplified these moments, the echoes of laughter, pranks, and gentle ribbing bouncing off wooden walls, weaving a network of camaraderie that was essential for survival. Oral histories, collected decades later from retired loggers, shed light on social dynamics within the bunkhouse. Men shared warmth and supplies, tended to injuries, and helped one another with chores. They traded skills, offered advice on the best way to chop a log or maintain an axe, and taught newcomers the rhythms of life in the forest. These accounts highlight that survival was not just about individual endurance but about practical cooperation, a human ecosystem thriving in the cold. Some diaries reveal moments of personal reflection. One logger in Quebec wrote, "It was bitterly cold and the work never ended. But I learned to laugh, to work with others, and to find small pleasures in a warm stove and hot coffee." Another noted the subtle ways in which the bunkhouse shaped identity. Life here teaches patience, humility, and reliance on others. There is no room for ego, only skill and cooperation matter. These reflections underscore a quiet truth. The bunkhouse was more than shelter, it was a crucible of character. Romance and personal connection also appeared sporadically. Letters from town trips often mentioned brief encounters or flirtations. They were fleeting, yet significant, emotional reprieves in a world dominated by snow, labor, and isolation. Even the simplest connections could brighten long winters, reminding loggers of life beyond the forest and the bunkhouse. Practical ingenuity surfaces repeatedly. Diaries describe improvising repairs to stoves, bunks, or clothing, inventing small comforts, or devising ways to make daily chores more manageable. These small acts of adaptation were necessary for survival, but they also fostered creativity, problem-solving, and subtle competition among bunkhouse residents. Ingenuity became a shared culture, quietly celebrated with nods, laughter, and stories passed from bunkmate to bunkmate. Older loggers often reflected on these experiences with a mixture of nostalgia and humility. They remembered discomfort, exhaustion, and danger, but also resilience, humor, and community. One oral historian recalls, "We laughed a lot because otherwise we'd cry. The bunkhouse was cold, cramped, and noisy, but it taught us to depend on each other. That's something I've carried my whole life." These personal accounts give texture to historical understanding, transforming the bunkhouse from a simple structure into a living, breathing social space. Even mundane details, the arrangement of bunks, the care of boots, the stacking of firewood, convey meaning. They represent attention to detail, cooperation, and an awareness of the environment. Each small act was a survival strategy, a lesson in foresight, and a contribution to the collective welfare. Diaries and letters preserve these insights in quiet, enduring ways. In sum, personal narratives illuminate the human side of bunkhouse life. They reveal endurance, humor, community, ingenuity, and small joys, all set against the backdrop of cold forests, long days, and monotonous labor. The bunkhouse emerges not merely as a historical artifact, but as a living space of memory, identity, and resilience. Chapter 20, Reflections and Legacy, Why the Bunkhouse Still Matters Today. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration, it's time to step back and consider what the bunkhouse teaches us beyond logs, stoves, and sawdust. More than just a shelter for men in the forest, the bunkhouse embodies lessons in endurance, community, ingenuity, and the quiet persistence of human spirit. Its legacy persists in ways both tangible and symbolic, reminding us why these simple structures continue to matter. The first lesson is endurance. Lumberjacks faced cold, exhaustion, injury, and monotony day after day. Survival required showing up, performing demanding tasks, and managing discomfort without complaint. This resilience was fostered by routine, practical knowledge, and the necessity of cooperation. Modern life rarely demands the same extremes, yet endurance remains a relevant skill. Persistence through challenges, consistency in effort, and the capacity to face repeated difficulty without losing resolve. The bunkhouse embodies these principles quietly, patiently, without fanfare. Community is another enduring lesson. The cramped quarters, shared stoves, and collective chores required cooperation. Men learned to depend on one another for warmth, meals, and safety. They shared humor, pranks, advice, and care. In doing so, the bunkhouse became more than shelter. It became a crucible for social cohesion. Today, whether in workplaces, schools, or even families, the importance of community, mutual support, and collaboration resonates just as strongly as it did in those frost-bitten forests. Ingenuity, too, remains central. Improvised repairs, adaptive problem-solving, and clever workarounds were daily necessities. The bunkhouse taught practical creativity, making the most of limited resources, solving problems under pressure, and finding small comforts amid adversity. These lessons extend well beyond logging. They remind us that human resourcefulness flourishes when necessity calls, and that creativity often emerges from constraints rather than abundance. Humor, often overlooked, is a crucial takeaway. Diaries and letters reveal that laughter softened hardship, strengthened bonds, and preserved morale. It reminds us that perspective matters, and that even in difficult circumstances, finding moments of levity is vital to endurance. In modern contexts, whether at work, in challenging projects, or in personal life, humor continues to be a tool for resilience and connection. The bunkhouse also teaches respect for simplicity and practicality. Life that was not glamorous or extravagant, it was functional. Success was measured not in wealth or status, but in survival, cooperation, and small, tangible victories. A warm bunk, a hot meal, or a well-maintained axe. The lesson is clear. Value often lies in the essential, in the everyday acts that sustain life and foster community, rather than in spectacle or excess. Culturally, the bunkhouse endures through folklore, museums, festivals, media, and education. Its stories preserve history while offering moral and practical lessons. Endurance, collaboration, ingenuity, and humor in adversity. Children learn through folk tales and educational exhibits. Adults reflect through documentaries and heritage projects. Enthusiasts engage through festivals and reconstructed camps. The bunkhouse serves as a bridge between past and present, connecting modern audiences to the lived experience of those who endured, created, and thrived under challenging conditions. Finally, the bunkhouse reminds us of the human capacity to adapt. Early loggers carved a life from raw timber, frost, and snow. Modern camps evolved with technology, efficiency, and comfort, yet the core lessons of endurance, community, and ingenuity persist. The transition highlights a broader principle. Environments change, tools improve, and conditions shift, but human values, creativity, and resilience remain central to thriving under new circumstances. So, as we leave the world of frostbitten floors, smoky stoves, and crowded bunks, the image of the bunkhouse lingers. It is at once a historical structure, a symbol of human endurance, and a cultural touchstone. Its significance extends beyond logs and sawdust. It teaches us how people endure, cooperate, innovate, and laugh together, even under extreme conditions. The bunkhouse may no longer house lumberjacks, and the forests may have regrown, but its lessons remain. Through memory, storytelling, and cultural preservation, it continues to inspire resilience, humility, creativity, and the quiet understanding that survival and life is often found in the small, shared moments that define the human experience. And with that, the story of the bunkhouse comes to a gentle close. From frozen forests to folklore, from practical ingenuity to cultural memory, it remains a testament to human endurance, camaraderie, and quiet heroism, a legacy carved in wood, frost, and imagination.